go. Dun, 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 dun. Bum, 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 bum. Yeah, break it down. What? Yeah, yeah. Eric, right in the door, bud. Good to see you, bud. Good to see you. Hope you had a good week off, bud. Hope you're doing well out there. I know you've been struggling with the COVIDs. I know that you're trying to find your path through it. I hope it's been improving for you, bud. This last weekend, one of the things I'm accepting is the time that I spend in capitalism, right? Like it's as long as I face it with an optimistic view, it's actually not so bad, right? I asked a girl out and she said yes, so that's very nice. Isn't that very nice? That makes it somewhat more tolerable, doesn't it? Isn't engaging in humanity make this whole thing a little bit more tolerable? Nice, says CR Stripey. Thanks, bud. I know you've always got my back, bud. I know it. It's just it. I find myself in this sort of like duality of thinking about what it is that I do here and what it is that we're doing here. First of all, guys, thank you so much for being here. I gotta tell you, every time I say this a lot, and I worry that I'm turning into a broken record, but it's just so nice that like when I hit this record button, when I hit this stream button, you guys pop in and you're here, and we're all facing this ridiculous nonsense together. And there is like this little piece, Ligandy, it's good to see you, bud. There is this little piece of me that's just like I could hang it all up, right, and just like put my head down and just grind into the capitalism, right? There is something to be said about ignorance is bliss, would be the phrase, right? Ignorance is bliss. I take a look at people who just have decided to check out. And there are people who, I know, there are people who have decided to check out. And when I do my weekends with capitalism, right, I kind of check out a little bit too, right? I don't really go on news and all this kind of stuff. And boy, howdy, is there something to it, isn't there? But the truth, and I know that this is true because I've tried to do this before. Good to see you, John Smith. I've tried to do this before where you try to check out, right? You try to just like, no, bury your head in the sand and all that kind of stuff. And it doesn't actually work. Right? Maybe it works for some people. And and I'm quite jealous of those people. I have to be honest. I'm quite jealous of those people who can just sort of walk around being like, everything's fine, just work, just work harder, if if you're really struggling, maybe you should think about getting a better job, right? No, and they're just walking around kind of blissfully living their life. Yeah. And it is good to deplug from politics, right, for a little while, but I know for myself, I can't do it for very long. And then you just end up kind of struggling in solitude. I think that's the worst part, right? That is actually the worst part. That the ignorance is bliss line for some of us, it only lasts a little while. It only goes so far. And then I find for myself, I end up looping back around. And when you're struggling in silence and when you're struggling in solitude, it's far worse than finding a group and finding people who are of a like mind. So you lot won't be getting rid of me very quickly. John Smith, I do nothing but work. I hate being idle. I mean, isn't that telling? Isn't that interesting, right? Like, all of this effort is being put in, and we're working so hard. And it's because we're afraid of being idle. I actually think that we could do, as a species, we could do with being idle for a little while. Do a little bit of self-reflection. Do a little bit of seeking, right? Do a little bit of actually asking ourselves what's going on and how can we improve this. This sort of manic need to constantly be productive and to constantly be moving and constantly be doing stuff, right? Like it's there's kind of a gaslighting thing. Yeah. 2 jobs, $20 an hour, so that makes it up. Yeah. Must be exhausting for you, John. Must be exhausting. Good to see you, Compton. Good to see you. Eric says, to be honest, I still watch some political videos here and there, and one video that I recently watched was a guy that described why Ukraine isn't falling as quickly as it should be. Well, near as I could tell, the Russians don't want to just blow the place up. Like, that's all. John, yeah, John's digging right down into the bottom of it, right? Like, to me, this is very profound what you're talking about here, John, right? John says, oh no, I don't want to be idle. Then my brain goes to all the stupid shit I've said and done. Yeah. The hardest thing for a person to do is deal with themselves. That's the fundamental truth. So much of what we're seeing in our society and so much of what happens in the world around us occurs because people are willing to do extravagant things in order to not have to deal with themselves, right? I actually strongly recommend that you do, right? Because what are you fundamentally doing here, right? You're living in a kind of personal cringe of one's past self, right? You're not forgiving yourself, right? You guys know me, right? You know me. I got this thing right behind me here, right? I was looking at it yesterday, right? And self-forgiveness, I forget which chakra that's associated with. Pretty sure it's up here, though. That seems right. And sounds to me, John, like you need to just do a little bit of self-forgiveness and just look at that cringy self, because everybody's got this, right? I know I do. I've got stuff that I think about in the past, and I'm like, ah. Missed opportunities, lost friendships, just plain idiotic things that you did. And I think the thing to do is just to accept that that's the case and just forgive yourself, right? Just say, yeah, that's how it is. And the way that the memory works is that when you remember something, you're not remembering the thing itself, you're remembering the last time you remembered it. And so the best thing to do is to try to make yourself laugh or to put a little levity into it. Because when you do that, then the next time you remember it, you're going to remember it and there's going to be a bit of levity to it, right? And that's why self-forgiveness is so important, because it follows that same sort of principle, right? Once you forgive yourself for something, then the next time you remember it, you'll remember it and you'll be a little softer on yourself, right? And then a little softer and then a little softer. Besides, I need all that money for lake property here in Minnesota, 23 acres with 900 of lakefront. Well, do you actually have that? Because that's nice. That's a very fortunate position to be in, John. Beautiful lakefront property, 23 acres. You should start a little commune, John. You ever think about that? Do a little commune. Invite people down. We could all become beekeepers and farmers. Sounds lovely. Turns out Russia, this is from Eric, turns out Russia is using 200k men while Ukraine is using a force of 800 to 900k men, a 4-to-1 ratio. They have so many bodies because they keep sending new troops to the front line after 3 days of training, but they don't have enough specialist training like tank crews. They're quickly being blown up, so it's just a slow crawl. And there's some Russians who are trying to convince Putin to send a force of 1 million men to end the war. First of all, Eric, I just asked a woman out. She's not my girlfriend or anything. I haven't even gone on a date yet, bud. But she knows I'm a communist, and I think she's okay with it, but we'll see. I love it, Eric. I immediately was like, I asked a woman out, and she said yes, and you're like, when's the wedding? It's very, very, very optimistic of you. Thank you, Eric. I'm glad that you're rooting for me so. John, you're saving up for a down payment? Well, I hope it goes your way, John. I really do. Uh, uh, One of the things that I'm always trying to do is, I'm always critiquing the system, and I always am deeply skeptical of the system, but I still want to root for people. I still want to root for people, and if you can make it happen, dude, I hope it happens for you. So keep on reaching for that rainbow, bud. And if it works out, I hope you tell me all about it, and we can celebrate together, and I'll ring a little bell for you. And if it doesn't, you come on in here, we'll have a cry about it, right? As simple as that. I'm rooting for you, bud. I'm rooting for you. Yeah. So let's move on to some of the headlines today, or some of the things going on, right? But before we do that, Cotton, if I won the lotto, I'd set up a table outside of my department and write $1 million gifts to all my coworkers. Isn't that lovely? Well, then I'm rooting for you, Cotton. You win that lotto. This is a Twitter comment. The majority PC party government here in Ontario is pushing through a law allowing chronically ill and or elderly patients to be moved to long-term care homes without their input. Anyone refusing a transfer may be on the hook for exorbitant hospital bills. This is structural coercion. People are beginning to see, right? MAID is on this. This is a nice little lotto thing going on here. The privatization of the healthcare system here in the province of Ontario is underway. They are not exactly being gentle about it, right? We are seeing very, very, very clear moves happening in order to attempt to privatize the system. And it just looks like the people of Ontario are fine with it, more or less, right? And what's this ultimately leading to? From the News Tribune, disturbing. Experts troubled by Canada's euthanasia laws. This is originally by the Associated Press. Alan Nicholas had a history of depression and other medical issues, but none were life-threatening. When the 61-year-old Canadian was hospitalized in June 2019 over fears he might be suicidal, he asked his brother to bust him out as soon as possible. Within a month, Nichols submitted a request to be euthanized, and he was killed, despite concerns raised by his family and a nurse practitioner. His application for euthanasia listed only one health condition as the reason for his request to die: hearing loss. Nichols' family reported the case to police and health authorities, arguing he lacked the capacity to understand the process and was not suffering unbearably. Among the requirements for euthanasia, they said he was not taking needed medication, he wasn't using the cochlear implants that helped him hear, and hospital staffers improperly helped him request euthanasia. Alan was basically put to death, his brother Gary Nichols said. Disability experts say the story is not unique in Canada, which arguably has the world's most permissive euthanasia rules, allowing people with serious disabilities to choose to be killed in the absence of any other medical issue. Many Canadians support euthanasia, and the advocacy group Dying with Dignity said the procedure is driven by compassion, an end to suffering and discrimination, and desire for personal autonomy. But human rights advocates say the country's regulations lack necessary safeguards, devalue the lives of disabled people, and are prompting doctors and health workers to suggest the procedure to those who might not otherwise consider it. Equally troubling, advocates say, are instances in which people have sought to be killed because they weren't getting adequate government support to live. Canada is set to expand euthanasia access next year, but these advocates say the system warrants further scrutiny now. Euthanasia cannot be a default for Canada's failure to fulfill its human rights obligations, said Mary Claude Landry, the head of the Human Rights Commission. Landry says she shares the grave concern voiced last year by 3 UN human rights experts who wrote Canada's euthanasia law appeared to violate the agency's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They said the law had a discriminatory impact on disabled people and was inconsistent with Canada's obligation to uphold international human rights standards. Tim Stainton, director of the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship at the University of British Columbia, described Canada's law as probably the biggest existential threat to disabled people since the Nazis' program in Germany in the 1930s. Tim During his recent trip to Canada, Pope Francis blasted what he has labeled the culture of waste that considers elderly and disabled people disposable. We need to learn how to listen to the pain of the poor and the most marginalized, Francis said, lamenting the patients who, in place of affection, are administered death. Canada prides itself on being liberal and accepting, said David Jones, director of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre in Britain, but what's happening with euthanasia suggests there may be a darker side. Euthanasia, where doctors use drugs to kill patients, is legal in 7 countries: Belgium, Canada, Colombia, Luxembourg, Netherlands, New Zealand, and Spain, plus several states in Australia. Other jurisdictions, including several U.S. states, permit assisted suicide, in which patients take the lethal drugs themselves, typically in a drink prescribed by a doctor. In Canada, the 2 options are referred to as medical assisted in dying, although more than 99.9% of such deaths are euthanasia. There were more than 10,000 deaths by euthanasia last year, an increase of about a third from the previous year. Canada's road to allowing euthanasia began in 2015, when its highest court declared outlawing assisted suicide deprived people of their dignity and autonomy. It gave national leaders a year to draft legislation. The resulting 2016 law legalized both euthanasia and assisted suicide for people aged 18 and older, provided they met certain conditions. They had to have a serious condition, disease or disability, that was in an advanced, irreversible state of decline, and enduring unbearable physical or mental suffering that cannot be relieved under conditions that patient considers acceptable. Their death also had to be reasonably foreseeable, and the request for euthanasia had to be approved by at least 2 physicians. The law was later amended to allow people who are not terminally ill to choose death, significantly broadening the number of eligible people. Critics say that change removed a key safeguard aimed at protecting people with potentially years or decades of life left. Today, any adult with a serious illness, disease, or disability can seek help in dying. Canadian Health Minister Jean-Yves Duclos said the country's euthanasia law recognizes the rights of all persons as well as the inherent and equal value of every life. The countries that allow euthanasia and assisted suicide vary in how they administer and regulate the practices, but Canada has several policies that set it apart from others. For example, unlike Belgium and the Netherlands, where euthanasia has been legal for 2 decades, Canada does not have monthly commissions to review potentially troubling cases, although it does publish yearly reports of euthanasia trends. Canada is the only country that allows nurse practitioners, not just doctors, to end patients' lives. Medical authorities in its 2 largest provinces, Ontario and Quebec, explicitly instruct doctors not to indicate on death certificates if people died from euthanasia. Belgian doctors are advised to avoid mentioning euthanasia to patients since it could be misinterpreted as medical advice. The Australian state of Victoria forbids doctors from raising euthanasia with patients. There are no such restrictions in Canada. The Association of Canadian Health Professionals who provide euthanasia tells physicians and nurses to inform patients if they might qualify to be killed as one of their possible clinical care options. Canadian patients are not required to have exhausted all treatment alternatives before seeking euthanasia, as in the case in Belgium and the Netherlands. Still, Duclos said there were adequate safeguards in place, including stringent eligibility criteria to ensure no disabled people were being encouraged or coerced into ending their lives. Government figures show more than 65% of people are being euthanized due to cancer, followed by heart problems, respiratory issues, and neurological conditions. Teresa Dejinger, a professor of law and disability studies at the Protestant University for Applied Sciences in northwestern Germany, said allowing euthanasia based exclusively on disability was a clear human rights violation. The implication of Canada's law is that a life with disability is automatically less worth living and that in some cases, death is preferable, said Degener. Alan Nichols lost his hearing after brain surgery at age 12 and suffered a stroke in recent years, but he lived mostly on his own. He needed some help from us, but he was not so disabled that he qualified for euthanasia, Gary Nichols said. In one of the assessments filed by a nurse practitioner before Nichols was killed, she noted his history of seizures, frailty, and a failure to thrive. She also wrote Nichols had had hearing and vision loss. The Nichols family were horrified his death appeared to be approved based partially on Alan's hearing loss, and had other concerns about how Alan was euthanized. They lodged complaints with the British Columbia agency that regulates doctors and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, asking for criminal charges. They also wrote to Canada's Minister of Justice. Somebody needs to take responsibility so that it never happens to another family, said Trish Nichols, Gary's wife. I'm terrified of my husband or another relative being put in the hospital and somehow getting these euthanasia forms in their hands. The hospital said Alan Nichols made a valid request for euthanasia and that in line with patient privacy, it was not obligated to inform relatives or include them in treatment discussions. The provincial regulatory agency, British Columbia's College of Doctors and Surgeons, told the family it could not proceed without a police investigation. In March, Royal Canadian Mounted Police Corporal Patrick Masonov emailed the relatives to say he had reviewed the documentation and concluded Alan Nichols met the criteria for euthanasia. The family's parliamentary representative, Laurie Thorness, asked British Columbia's health minister for public investigation, calling the death deeply disturbing. The health minister, Adrian Dix, said the province's oversight unit reviewed the case and has not referred it for any further inquiry. He pointed out the euthanasia law does not allow for families to review euthanasia requests or be privy to hospitals' decisions. Trudeau Lemons, chair of health law and policy at the University of Toronto, said it was astonishing. Authorities concluded Nichols' death was justified. This case demonstrates that the rules are too loose and that even when people die who shouldn't have died, there is almost no way to hold the doctors and hospitals responsible, he said. Some disabled Canadians have decided to be killed in the face of mounting bills. Before being euthanized in August 2019 at age 41, Sean Taggart struggled to get the 24-hour daycare he needed. The government provided Taggart, who had Lou Gehrig's disease, with 16 hours of daily care at his home in Powell River, British Columbia. He spent about $206 a day to pay coverage during the other 8 hours. Health authorities proposed Taggart move into an institution, but he refused, saying he would be too far from his young son. He called the suggestion a death sentence in an interview with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Before his death, Taggart had raised more than $12,400 to buy specialized medical equipment he needed to live at home with caretakers, but it still wasn't enough. I know I'm asking for change, Taggart wrote in a Facebook post before his death. I just didn't realize that it was an unacceptable thing to do. Stainton, the University of British Columbia professor, pointed out no province or territory provides a disability benefit income above the poverty line. In some regions, he said, it is as low as $662 a month, less than half the amount the government provided to people unable to work during the COVID-19 pandemic. Heidi Jans, an assistant adjunct professor in disability ethics at the University of Alberta, said, a person with disabilities in Canada has to jump through so many hoops to get support that it can often be enough to tip the scales and lead them to euthanasia. Duclos, the national health minister, told the Associated Press he could not comment on specific cases, but said all jurisdictions have a broad range of policies to support disabled people. He acknowledged disparity in access to services and supports across the country. Other disabled people say the easy availability of euthanasia has led to unsettling and sometimes frightening discussions. Roger Foley, who has a degenerative brain disorder and is hospitalized in London, Ontario, was so alarmed by staffers mentioning euthanasia, he began secretly recording some of the conversations. In one recording obtained by the AP, the hospital's directors of ethics told Foley for him to remain in the hospital, it would cost north of $1,500 a day. Foley replied mentioning fees felt like coercion and asked what plan there was for his long-term care. "Roger, this is not my show," the ethicist responded. "My piece of this was to talk to you, to see if you had an interest in assisted dying." Foley said he had never previously mentioned euthanasia. The hospital says there is no prohibition on staff raising the issue. Catherine Frazee, a professor emerita at Toronto Ryerson University, said cases like Foley's were likely just the tip of the iceberg. "It is difficult to quantify it because there is no easy way to track these cases, but I and other advocates are hearing regularly from disabled people every week who are considering euthanasia," she said. Frazee cited the case of Candace Lewis, a 25-year-old woman who has cerebral palsy and spina bifida. Lewis's mother, Sheila Elson, took her to an emergency room in Newfoundland 5 years ago. During her hospital stay, a doctor said Lewis was a candidate for euthanasia, and if her mother chose not to pursue it, that would be selfish, Elson told the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Canada has tweaked its euthanasia rules since they were first enacted 6 years ago, but critics say more needs to be done, especially as Canada expands access further. Next year, the country is set to allow people to be killed exclusively for mental health reasons. It is also considering extending euthanasia to mature minors, children under 18, who met the same requirements as adults. Chantal Auberton, spokeswoman for Canadian Justice Minister David Lametti, said in an email, the government had taken into account concerns raised by the disability community when it added safeguards to its euthanasia regulations last year. Those changes included that people were to be informed of all services, such as mental health support and palliative care, before asking to die. Auberton said those and other measures would help to honor the difficult and personal decisions of some Canadians to end their suffering on their own terms, while enshrining important safeguards to protect the vulnerable. Dr. Jean Marmoro, a family physician who regularly provides euthanasia services in Ontario, has called for specialized panels to provide a second opinion in difficult cases. "I think this is not something you want to rush, but at the same time, if the person has made a considered request for this and they meet the eligibility criteria, then they should not be denied their right to a dignified death," she said. Landry, Canada's Human Rights Commissioner, said leaders should listen to the concerns of those facing hardships, who believe euthanasia is their only option. She called for social and economic rights to be enshrined in Canadian law to ensure people can get adequate housing, health care, and support. "In an era where we recognize the right to die with dignity, we must do more to guarantee the right to live with dignity," she said. This image shows part of the medical request form for euthanasia, filled out by Alan Nichols of Chilliwack, British Columbia, Canada. His application listed only one health condition as the reason for his request to die: hearing loss. The current law allows people with serious disabilities to choose to be killed in absence of other medical issues. This photo, provided by Gary Nichols, shows him right with brother Alan on the eve of his euthanasia in Chilliwack, British Columbia, Canada. For you, Major, as always. Enter. My concern, of course, is always they are declining services, right? What is inflation doing, right? It's raising rent, it's raising prices, it's making it more and more unlivable, right? So they don't even need to go in and actively decline the amount of the amount that they give to disabled people, right? Inflation does that for them. They don't need to go in and lower the amount of ODSP. They don't need to go in and lower the amount of disability. Here in Canada, we actually give less to disabled people than the United States does, right? So you think about the shit show about the United States. Well, when it comes to disabled people, the U.S. is ahead of us, right? And and what is obviously happening, right, is that we are looking at we are entering a period of time where we are not that different from the Nazis. We're calling disabled people useless eaters, right? And if we're not calling them that, we're certainly treating them that way, right? And we're funneling them into this system of euthanasia, right? Because we're giving them no alternatives. I think the line of the piece, in my view, is this one. In an era where we recognize the right to die with dignity, we must do more to guarantee the right to live with dignity. And we're not guaranteeing that right. This very straightforwardly, we are not guaranteeing that right to disabled citizens. And we are not creating a society and a culture that is interested in facilitating the existences of people who are not useful to the capitalist structure. Because that's really what it comes down to. Like, what is it that Doug Ford has been saying of disabled people? He's been telling them to go get jobs, right? That is outright what he has been saying to these people. That you, by definition, are disabled, and that, by definition, means that you cannot get a job. Well, too bad. So says the premier of the province and his voters, right? And the voter base of just narcissistic psychopaths who support him. Basically saying to disabled people, go get jobs. Failing to mention, of course, that the way that the system is structured is if they go and get jobs, what happens? They lose their support, right? So if they actually were to follow that advice, it would be a huge detriment to them. And this is what they are saying instead of what they actually want to say, which is go die. That's what they're actually saying. And it's time for us to acknowledge that that's the case, and time for us to recognize that when these guys are saying just get a job to disabled people, they are saying just go die. Use the medically assisted dying program. That's why we did it, right? This whole dying with dignity thing is just the grift that they're using in order to euthanize disabled people who they think are useless eaters, right? Canada's swing towards far-right fascism is happening right in front of our eyes. And we are coming to a pretty high Nazi point. Under these liberals, no less, right? It's not going to get any better under the conservatives, but the liberals are fine with this, right? This kind of, oh, we've got to do it to be compassionate. Well, okay, so you want to be compassionate. How about you put in some extra supports for disabled people? No? How are you going to pay for that? Oh, okay. Well, we got to raise the police budget again. Oh, okay. Well, we got to send $1 billion to Ukraine. Oh, okay. Interesting. Interesting how that all works. Interesting how that all works. I can picture Dofo and Jack Boots with a riding crop. Yeah, so says Radio Halifax. Yeah, Compton, what in the Christ? Yeah. Is this news to you, Compton? Yeah. Fuck Canada to ashes. What have I been saying this whole time? What have I been saying this whole time? The system that we live in cannot be reformed. It cannot be reformed. This is its natural outcroppings. This is what the system produces. And you can't reform it. You have to replace it. It's very, very, very simply. And you have to replace it with an idea that the system exists for the benefit of the citizens, not for a profit motive. Because that really is the central issue of what's going on. We've structured a society that says if it makes money, it's good, and if it doesn't, it's bad. Instead of saying if it has good outcomes for citizens, it's good. And if it doesn't have good outcomes for citizens, it's bad. No wheelchair ramps yet either, yeah. Remember, eugenics isn't inherently evil, Boosh. It blows me away that someone like Vosh has a I mean, you want evidence that you live in an extreme far-right society, it's Vosh. Like this pretend fake progressive person who is essentially a far-right neo-Nazi type. I have documentary idea. I'll film me trying to get into maids as a disabled person, and I'll uncover the dark side. You do it. Do it, Major. Do it. Like I would think that you're the biggest baller in the world if you did that. Straight up. That would be absolutely incredible. The strongest people who I see in the society today are disabled people fighting. I organize with a trans woman who is disabled, right? And she's one of the strongest people I know. She's just unwilling to accept what is happening in the society, unwilling to accept what's happening to her, and unwilling to accept that this is how the society is going. And I really admire it. I really admire it. Anemone says, as a disabled person, the thought of just ending it because of ableism is always in the back of my mind. Yeah, and that's what's happening. That is what's happening, right? That the leadership of the country, the wealthy people in the country, right? They can't be bothered with it. They can't be bothered with it. That there is this desire to cleanse the society. There's a desire to purge it, right? To create that more pure society, right? Let the strong survive. That kind of idea is very, very, very prescient in the society at all times. Generation Why Me? Good to see you, Generation. I mean, some disabled people can really have jobs, but not all of them. And disabled people should be able to work if they can and shouldn't be discriminated against. I mean, I tend to agree with you, Generation. Like, if a disabled person would like to participate in the workforce and can do so, right? But the way that it's structured here in Canada is that if they do join the workforce, they lose a lot of their support, right? So we need to address that. If that's something that we're serious about, where we're actually saying we want to see disabled people be able to pursue work, right? But remember, we're talking about the difference between being able to pursue work and forced to pursue work, right? That, like, I genuinely am of the opinion that most people would like to pursue some kind of work, right? Maybe it isn't work as defined by the death cult, right? Maybe that it's not work that the death cult would value, but work nonetheless, right? And there's a difference between wanting to pursue that kind of a work and being coerced to work for capitalists because otherwise you'll starve or be rendered homeless, which is the threat, isn't it? And we are putting disabled people in this country into an incredible bind. Like, there's no other way to describe it. It is an incredible bind. And it is a bind that is as bad as what the Nazis were doing in Germany. And I'm not saying that hyperbolically. We are saying to disabled people, your choice is this: struggle in poverty and homelessness, eking out a pain-filled existence that we will not try to improve for you, or go die, which we freely will give you access to. It's quite a brutal choice. It's quite a brutal choice, and given the structure of the way the laws work here in Canada, there's a lot of coercion built into the system as well. So it's very, very scary. Yeah, Vosh has defended on multiple occasions pedophiles. Yeah. Like, in my view, Vosh is just a guy who is popular because he got in the door first thing. He was able to do it right away. Like, he's a CIA snitch. He's outright admitted it. And he just has been doing that. He was one of the first guys to do this kind of stuff. And so that's really all it is, you know? Methane says, always put pressure on and take from those that can't defend themselves in order to prop up those that have too much already. This is the capitalist way. Yep. You can lose support from... Yeah, you can lose support for marriage, too, if you're in a disabled situation. And generally, yeah, it's not like they should be forced into working. They should be able to work and paid without getting their ODSP and other payments taken back, too, of course. I think you can work for like an extra $300 a week in Ontario. Only an extra $300, yeah. No, I mean, the whole system is coercive. It's designed to be coercive to even our most vulnerable citizens, right? It's a system of coercion. And in the case of people with disabilities, it's now being, that the coercion is not simply work yourself to death for people you'll never meet who don't care about you and do no work themselves. It is now go die, right? Very, very scary time. Very scary time. Speaking of scary time, and of course, while this is going on, Ontario passes motion to skip public hearings on long-term care legislation. So, literally what they're doing, Ontario will skip public hearings for legislation that would allow hospital patients awaiting long-term care to be transferred to a nursing home without their consent, despite concerns from seniors and advocates. The Progressive Conservative government passed a motion Monday to advance a bill without having it considered by committee or be subject to public hearings. We need them in a home, Premier Doug Ford said in the legislature. The opposition NDP sought to stop the government from skipping the public hearing process, but that motion failed. The legislation would allow hospital patients to be transferred to a temporary long-term care home without their consent while they await a bed in their preferred facility. The province says there are about 6,000 patients in hospital who require an alternate level of care and should be discharged from the hospital. Among those patients, 2,000 are on a waiting list for long-term care homes, the province said. So essentially, people are just going to get shuffled around, right? Wait until some of these people just get lost in the system. This is something that, this is why it's dangerous to elect people who don't have like a systems mind in place, right? Because they don't think that people will get lost in these systems, and they will. People will get lost in these systems, right? And the fact that the Ford government is pushing this forward without any committee, without any advice or any of that kind of stuff, shows the callous nature of the Ford administration. But what do you expect from a thug like Ford, right? So, in happier news, moving on to some climate change, major sea level rise caused by melting of Greenland ice cap is now inevitable. Loss will contribute a minimum rise of 27 centimeters regardless of what climate action is taken, scientists discovered. Major sea level rise from the melting of the Greenland ice cap is now inevitable, scientists have found, even if the fossil fuel burning that is driving the climate crisis were to end overnight. The research shows the global heating to date will cause an absolute minimum sea level rise of 10.6 inches to 27 centimeters from Greenland alone, as 110 tons of ice melt. With continued carbon emissions, the melting of other ice caps and thermal expansion of the ocean, a multi-meter sea level rise appears likely. Billions of people live in coastal regions, making flooding due to rising sea levels one of the greatest long-term impacts of the climate crisis. If Greenland's record melt year of 2012 becomes a routine occurrence later this century, as is possible, then the ice cap will deliver a staggering 78 centimeters of sea level rise, the scientists said. Previous studies have used computer models of ice cap behavior to estimate future losses, but the physical processes are complex, and this leads to significant uncertainties in the results. In contrast, the study published in the Journal of Nature Climate Change used satellite measurements of ice losses from Greenland and the shape of the ice cap from 2000 to 2019. This data enabled the scientists to calculate how far global heating to date has pushed the ice sheet from an equilibrium where snowfall matches the ice lost. This allowed the calculation of how much more ice must be lost in order to regain stability. It is a very conservative rock bottom minimum, said Professor Jason Box from the National Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, who led the research. Realistically, we will see this figure more than double within this century. The 27 centimeter estimate is a bare minimum because it only accounts for global heating so far, and because some ways in which glacier ice is lost at the margins of the ice sheet are not included. The advantage of this study is that it provides a solid estimate of inevitable sea level rise, but the method used does not give a time scale over which the ice will be lost. Nonetheless, Based on the scientists' overall understanding of how sheets such as Greenland lose ice into the ocean, the researchers said most of the rise would occur relatively soon. In 2021, other scientists warned that a significant part of the Greenland ice sheet was on the brink of a tipping point. The minimum of 27 centimeters is the sea level rise deficit that we have accrued to date, and it's going to get paid out, no matter what we do, going forward, said Dr. William Colgan, also at Gaius. Whether it's coming in 100 years or 150 years, it's coming. And the sea level rise we are committed to is growing at present because of the climate trajectory we are on. Colgan said, if 2012 becomes a normal year, then the committed loss grows to 78 centimeters, which is staggering. And the fact that we're already flickering into that range of ice loss is shocking. But the difference between 78 centimeters and 27 centimeters highlights the difference that can be made through implementing the Paris Agreement. There is still a lot of room to minimize the damage. Mountain glaciers in the Himalayas and the Alps are already on course to lose a third and a half of their ice, respectively, while the West Antarctic ice sheet is also thought by some scientists to be past the point at which major losses are inevitable. Warming oceans also expand, adding to sea level rises. There is growing support in the scientific literature for multi-meter levels of rise within the next 100 to 200 years, said Colgan. A collapse of the colossal East Antarctic ice sheet, which would lead to a 52-meter rise in sea levels if it all melted, could be averted if rapid climate action is taken. Professor Gail Whiteman at the University of Exeter, who was not part of the study team, said, the results of the new study are hard to ignore for all business leaders and politicians concerned about the future of humanity. It is bad news for the nearly 600 million people that live in coastal zones worldwide. As sea levels rise, they will increasingly be vulnerable, and it threatens approximately $1 trillion of global wealth. She said political leaders must rapidly scale up funding for climate adaptation and damage. In the face of all of this, we have an increase in methane going on as well. Methane hunters. What explains the surge in the potent greenhouse gas? Hey Chris, how you doing? Good to see you. I used to like ice caps, so tasty. Now I hate them, but I wish they'd stay around. Yeah, isn't that right? Isn't that right? Every year, 6,000 flasks arrive at a laboratory in Boulder, Colorado. Inside each is a sample of air, taken from one of a chain of 50 monitoring stations that spans the globe. Together, these samples could help answer one of the most important questions facing the planet. Why is there so much methane in the atmosphere? Blue and black canisters filled with air from Algeria, Alaska, China, and Samoa are lined up and ready for testing. We collect these flask samples and they come back here, said Ed how's this for a name? Dlugokenki, a chemist at the Global Monitoring Laboratory run by the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The laboratory measures the levels of different gases inside the samples, from carbon dioxide to nitrous oxide and sulfur hexafluoride, compiling a meticulous record that forms the basis for major climate models. About 15 years ago, its researchers observed an uptick in atmospheric methane, a potent greenhouse gas with a warming impact 80 times greater than CO2. Many researchers initially assumed the increase was linked to fossil fuel production. Methane is the primary ingredient in natural gas, but is also produced by other human activities such as landfills, rice paddies, and raising cattle. In the past few years, however, that uptick has accelerated into a surge. The implications for global warming are immense. Of the 1.1 C increase in global temperatures since pre-industrial times, about a third can be attributed to methane. Atmospheric methane had its highest growth rate ever recorded by modern instruments in 2020, and then that record was broken again in 2021. Nobody knows exactly why. It's shocking, says Lindsay Gillan, a researcher based in the Boulder laboratory who is analyzing the data. A lot of research, a lot of scientists are trying to explain it. Atmospheric methane reaches highest level ever recorded by modern instruments. You can see its growth rate accelerating over a 20-year period. One thing they have begun to identify is what kind of methane is culpable for the increase. Methane derived from fossil sources contains more of the carbon-13 isotope than atmospheric methane, while that produced by microbial sources, such as wetlands, cattle, and landfills, contains less. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, fossil fuel emissions have tilted the ratio of methane isotopes in the atmosphere towards carbon-13. But around 2007, when atmospheric methane started to climb again, that atmospheric ratio went into reverse. The recent increase in methane is not coming primarily from fossil fuels, but from other sources. That suggests the planet itself could be emitting more methane, and it is not slowing down. We're seeing a very substantial change, says Dlugo Kenke. After 200 years of increasing, all of a sudden we're starting to see a decrease in delta carbon-13. That means something significant has happened. Determining what that something significant is requires close study of methane emitted from a variety of sources, from wetlands and shallow lakes in the tropics to melting permafrost in the Arctic, from landfills and agriculture to the fossil fuel industry, as well as the chemical sinks that remove it from the atmosphere. Methane is a very interesting type of greenhouse gas because it has so many types of sources and sinks that you have to keep track of, said Dlugo Kenke. You have to look at it like you are a detective trying to solve a criminal mystery. This is how I think of it. Sources and sinks. So fossil fuel, agricultural waste, wildfires and biomes burning, wetlands, other natural emissions, and then your sinks, chemical reactions, sink in soil. Chemical reactions, how about that? Unraveling the mystery will reveal whether or not the world might face the worst-case scenario of a methane bomb, a feedback loop where a warmer planet emits more of the gas naturally, driving temperatures up further. It's a terrifying prospect, one that scientists studying this topic tend to tiptoe around, particularly in interviews. We can have a gut feeling that the climate feedback might be happening, says Lan, but it can be difficult to separate the signals from the noise. Others are more direct. If you think of fossil fuel emissions as putting the world on a slow boil, methane is a blowtorch that is cooking us today, said Durwood Zelke, president of the Institute of Governance and Sustainable Development, and an advocate of stricter policies to reduce methane emissions. The fear is that this is a self-reinforcing feedback loop. If we let the Earth warm enough to start warming itself, we are going to lose this battle. Hunting for clues. For years, methane was somewhat overlooked by the scientific community and by policymakers who tended to focus more on CO2 emissions. Part of the reason for that is because atmospheric methane appeared to be leveling off between 2000 and 2007. Now, researchers are using both isotopic measurements and satellite data to determine the origins of the surge in methane. They know that the increase is coming from microbial sources because of the shift in the carbon-13 ratio. But which microbial sources exactly? Wetlands, cattle, and landfills all produce microbial methane, in which the microbes break down carbon and generate the greenhouse gas. To determine how much each of these sources is contributing, scientists are scouring the globe for data points. Paul Palmer, an atmospheric chemist at the University of Edinburgh, compares it to a game of Cluedo, the children's detective board game. The satellite data will give you the location of the murder, said Palmer, and the isotopes will give you the weapon, the type of source. Natural sources contribute to methane emissions. Wetlands, freshwater, other natural. Wetlands and cattle appear to be the biggest culprits, says Ewan Nisbet, professor of earth sciences at Royal Holloway, University of London. The biological sources are increasing faster, he says. The most intense growth seems to be coming from the tropics, a global increase in cattle raising, and in landfills is also fueling the growth in microbial emissions. In an upcoming paper, Lan and Dlugokenki reached a similar conclusion. 85% of the increase in atmospheric methane since 2007 is due to microbial sources, and about half of that is from the tropics. Using satellite data, Palmer has zeroed in on East Africa as a source of increased emissions, such as the Sud wetland in South Sudan. We are seeing a huge methane enhancement due to wetland emissions. We've only known that since 2019, he adds. Other tropical areas with wetlands, such as Southeast Asia and the Amazon, are showing an increase as well. When wetlands get wetter, it leads to more methane emissions because the microbes that produce methane have more organic matter on which to feed. The sources of the methane may be natural, but a climate warmed by human activity is fueling these emissions. Climate change is expected to lead to more intense rainfall in East Africa, and these wetter, warmer wetlands will produce more methane. Other natural sources of methane, melting permafrost and wildfires, are also linked to climate change. While Palmer works with satellites, other scientists are working on the ground, physically traveling around the globe to capture methane samples in canisters to be sent to laboratories. The Royal Holloway Lab is filled with boxes of samples shipped in from around the planet. These are exciting, says Rebecca Fisher, a lecturer in atmospheric sciences at the university, gesturing to a box that has just arrived. They are flasks of air from the Halley Research Station in Antarctica. Because Antarctica has no vegetation, the air there contains very little locally produced methane, making it ideal to provide background measurements. Fisher is preparing for a trip to Finland, near the other end of the globe from Antarctica, to collect samples that will measure what she calls the isotropic fingerprint of wetland emissions in the Arctic. By measuring not only the carbon-13 isotope, but also the hydrogen isotope deuterium, known as heavy hydrogen, her group and others are working to build a library of these fingerprints. We get really different signatures in the Arctic versus the tropics, Fisher says. By taking these isotropic measurements, we can see if that fits with what is in the atmosphere. As well as helping scientists piece together the current surge in methane emissions, the Arctic also gives an idea of what future emissions might look like. The region is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. Permafrost itself contains around 1,500 billion tons of carbon, says Katie Walter Anthony, professor of ecology and biochemistry at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. As permafrost thaws, that carbon can be turned into methane by microorganisms known as methanogens. She has flown all over Alaska to measure the methane coming out of lakes, and what she has seen recently has surprised her. In the last 5 to 6 years, I have just seen incredible change, she says. It seems like we crossed a threshold, and we are seeing crazy things happening. Methane emissions by source. Tropical areas have accounted for about 40% of the recent growth in atmospheric methane since 2017. The Sud wetlands in South Sudan and the Tumba Ngiri main drum wetland in DR Congo are large sources for methane emissions. Russia is the world's biggest emitter of methane from oil and gas. The US is the world's second largest. Agriculture and waste, cow burps, and manure account for around 30% of anthropogenic methane emissions. India and Brazil have the biggest cattle populations. Burning of forests and grasslands as well as wildfires contributes to methane emissions. One of those crazy things is that the lakes are forming, a lot of them, as permafrost melts. These pools, known as thermokarst lakes, are spreading rapidly, and the microbes that produce methane thrive on all the newly thawed organic material at the bottom of these new lakes. In interior Alaska, we've seen a nearly 40% increase in lake area since the 1980s of new thermokarst lakes forming, says Anthony. These lakes emit methane at least 10 times higher than a normal lake. They are hotspots. Anthony says current climate models greatly underestimate the methane released by these lakes. In a 2018 research paper in Nature Communications, she calculated that methane could become the dominant source of atmospheric warming from our permafrost gases this century, between 2050 and 2070, if our greenhouse gas emissions continue on current trends. For now, the methane emissions from those lakes are much lower than from wetlands in the tropics. We're watching the Arctic, but at the moment the Arctic does not appear to be leading the problem, says Nisbet. There are a lot of potential feedbacks here. In the Arctic, we need to keep watching that. Cutting the gas. While there is little that governments can do about the methane bubbling out of wetlands and thermokarst lakes, they have already promised to reduce the amount produced from human-caused sources. Around half of methane emissions come from anthropogenic sources and half from natural sources. More than 100 countries signed up to the Global Methane Pledge, launched at the COP26 Climate Summit last year, pledging to collectively cut methane emissions 30% by the end of this decade. Cutting methane emissions would have a more immediate impact on temperatures within a human lifetime than cutting CO2. That's because methane lasts only a decade in the atmosphere, depending on conditions, compared to the century or more CO2 remains there. A concerted global effort to reduce methane emissions using existing technologies could slash anthropogenic emissions by 45% by 2030, according to a May 2021 report from the UN Environment Programme, avoiding 0.3 Celsius of warming by the 2040s. The quickest methane fixes are in the fossil fuel sector, which accounts for about 1/3 of anthropogenic emissions. Special venting installed in coal mines, early detection of gas leaks, reducing methane venting during oil and gas production, and other readily available measures could cut methane emissions by more than 40 million tons a year, according to the report. Capturing natural gas from landfills would even pay for itself because of its resale value. Still, it's not clear this will be enough. The world's biggest methane emitters, China and Russia, have not signed the COP26 pledge, and even if they did, it's not clear that reductions in human-caused methane will be enough to compensate for the increase from natural sources. If the warming Earth is already starting to release more methane, then this vicious cycle, in which warming triggers more warming, could become self-perpetuating. Although that moment could be still decades in the future, once the tipping point is reached, it will be very hard to reverse. Anticipating this, some groups are starting to study methane removal, whether there might be ways to pull methane directly from the air. While mostly hypothetical at this point, the ideas include increasing the amount of chemical sinks in the atmosphere, for example by adding tiny iron oxide particles to the air. Other approaches include using methane-eating bacteria to act as a filter for methane, such as in dairy farms. Yet even as methane rises in priority, funding to monitor it has not kept pace. There really hasn't been a big expansion of our network in the last 15 or 20 years, says Dlugokankaki. Federal funding cuts a decade ago mean the network today is smaller than it used to be. Still, the methane hunters keep going. Right now we are trying to work out just the source signatures. We need to get a global database, says Nisbet. He has recently returned from a trip to Canada, where he was collecting swamp samples. Although Nisbet is nearing retirement, he keeps going out in the field searching for the answer to the riddle. Our level of primary knowledge is still very, very low, he said. Methane keeps kicking up these surpluses, these surprises. You know, I think it's worth playing a song. It's worth playing a song. I haven't played a song on the thing for a little while. Give me 1 second here, guys. Yeah. Oh. And then I almost died. Wouldn't that have been great? Just like, boom, immediately dead on the stream. Maybe I shouldn't joke about such things, but too bad. It's my stream. I can do what I want. Oh, I want you, methane. death's sweet kiss comes to sweep me off my feet. I hope by then we've learned a little more. I'd like this place to be better than before, so everybody's safe, no one's living in the streets. You never need to worry if you're gonna get to Eden. Antarctica is covered in ice, and everybody's happy, and wouldn't that be nice when everybody's safe, no one's living in the streets. You never need to worry if you're gonna get to Eden. Antarctica is covered in ice. Antarctica is covered in ice. I still think that we can do it, you know? I still think I will always. I will always. I will believe every minute. Even as our forests burn down. Even as our prairies desertify. Even as the waters come up. Even as our water becomes undrinkable. Even as the land produces nothing but poison. I will always believe. I will always believe that it can be done and that we can do it. Because the answer to the problem is actually quite simple. The earth created a garden. It spawned us in this garden. It wanted this to be a garden. It wants us to be here in a garden. That we don't really need to invent anything or create anything or make anything. We don't need to be clever or intelligent or smart. We don't need to do anything except humble ourselves to the forces of nature and the forces of the universe that created us in the first place. The earth is more than capable of healing itself. Thank you very much. And if we would like to be around to witness this event occur, then all we have to do is stop. Good opportunity to remind everybody, please like, share, subscribe. Top of the hour ad break. My apologies for that. I'm not a big fan of giving you guys ads, but Radio Halifax, the lungs on you. Yep, it is one of my many superpowers. Something, I was born with that. Sure, I've done work on it and I've fostered it, but I was born with that. I don't understand your comment, Ligandes. I didn't know Jordan Peterson can sing, let alone care about these things. I think if Jordan Peterson was singing, he'd be a lot more of an intelligent person. The throat chakra, right? Energy comes from the bottom to the top, right? To balance it, you chant, write, or sing. And so I find that when I get myself into a position where I'm not wanting to sing, that's when I need to sing the most. Hope is the undying flower. Exactly. The greatest enemy we have in front of us today, the greatest enemy that we have to face today is hopelessness. Hopelessness is absolutely how the species will be eradicated. That if we fall into hopelessness, then that's the end of us. And so we always need to have hope, even if it doesn't make sense, even if it's irrational. We do need to have hope. And of course, there's a Jordan Peterson song. It annoys me that Peterson is still in the discourse, frankly. Like, I was even talking to my dad the other day, and Dad brought up Jordan Peterson, and I was like, you know, this is what happens when you destroy the creative and spiritual institutions and society in your culture, right? Like, we have systematically gone after the artistic pursuits that exist in the society, and all artists that exist in the society today are making art within the confines and the rules of capitalism. And so everything is by default pro-capitalist. It has to be, right? Because if it isn't, then you don't get roles, you don't get produced, you don't get anywhere, right? And everything becomes corporatized, everything becomes just about how to make money. And then on top of that, it's just a constant producing of this kind of pro-capitalist dreck. And so you end up with a stale, dead culture. So frauds like Peterson can come around who say things like, the Bible is the foundation of truth in the world, and he doesn't read it. Like, it's very, very simple. Like, a man like Jordan Peterson is talking about how the Bible is the foundation of truth. He's never read the Bible. Never. I'd be surprised to find out that he even has opened it up, honestly. Because, like, his whole, like, do it yourself and bootstrap yourself and pull yourself up and you can do it and all that kind of stuff, right? Yeah, because that's what Christ was saying. Christ was walking around saying to lepers that were on the side of the road, he told a story called the Good Samaritan that was all about the Samaritan walking up and saying, just get up by your bootstraps and do it yourself, right? Christ certainly didn't say, give your money to the poor, right? Sell your possessions. The early Christians certainly didn't sell all their possessions and give their money to the poor, right? None of that actually happened, right? And it's extremely obvious what happened with Peterson. And it's the same thing going on with Shapiro, which is that they're espousing a pro-corporate, pro-capitalist, pro-fascist narrative. And so they're just getting bombarded and blasted across whatever platform exists, right? They just get picked up by everybody, and everybody sends them out, and suddenly he's on every single panel and all this. And so regular, normal people are just like, oh, this is a serious person who must have a serious perspective, when his serious perspective is, I'm a fraud, right? Peterson is like the definition of a fraud. Like, if all he ever was a cheerleader, right, which is how I met him, where he was just like, you can do it. Like, if that was his whole position, nothing wrong with that. But that's not what it is, right? It's, you can do it, and the system that exists is perfect. You're the problem. He's a gaslighter. He's just a gaslighter. Plain and simple. Yep, DM, I hate those liberal media articles telling us how to save money on food and money during inflation. Yeah, and the people who are writing these articles are millionaires, right? So you have millionaires bribed by billionaires to convince the proletariat that the problem is us, right? Danarchist, good to see you. Hello, everyone. Sorry I missed last week. I'm recovering from COVID. Oh, my God. I hope you're doing well, Danarchist. I hope you didn't get the long COVID. I know that there are people in the chat who are still dealing with the effects of long COVID, so that can be a real kicker, right? It can be a real kicker. So I hope you're doing well. No, there's a reason why all of, like, the standard media outlets, the legacy media, if you like, are losing credibility. right? They're losing credibility because, like, how about instead of publishing an article that says how to save money on food, right, or to save money during inflation, how about you talk about, hey, why are corporations permitted to, like, why don't we arrest these people? That's the art. Like, where's those articles? Where's the articles in the New York Times and the Economist and all this kind of stuff saying, yeah, like, inflation is just corporations gouging us. That's all it is. So how about we arrest them? Right? Do what Nixon did. Go on television and say, if you raise prices tomorrow, we're gonna come and we're gonna arrest you. And inflation stopped. Oh, it turns out inflation is literally just corporations gouging us. Right? Like, if inflation was occurring and corporations were also losing money or even plateauing in terms of their profit margin, they would have a point. But that's not what's happening. Right? Inflation is going up and corporations are making record profits. Well, what the fuck do you think is happening? Like, what the fuck do you think is happening? And constantly when I say this sort of stuff, it's just constant simping. And that's all it is at this point. It's just like watching, like, Renfrew from Bram Stoker's Dracula, who's just like, yes, master, well, you can't speak ill of the master. You know, we're just in this period of time where the only people who are permitted to have their shit blasted all over national airways are basically just in the thrall of capital and aren't interested in critiquing it because they're getting bribed by it, right? That's all it is. And they don't care. They don't care about their countrymen. They don't care. Yeah, where's the article about how all these jobs are minimum wage and part-time? Yeah. Like, where look, the populace is on, right? The populace is on to it. Polls suggest Canadians think grocery stores are taking advantage of inflation, right? The populace knows, right? A recent poll by the Angus Reid Institute found a lot of Canadians questioning it. Only 7%. Among the findings was that 78% say grocery stores are taking advantage of inflation. So even the dim-witted conservative liberal voters who are completely disconnected from reality are still going, yeah, but these guys are gouging us. Very, very plainly, very straightforwardly, right? We know. We understand what's happening. And the fact that our leadership is so pathetic and weak and so incapable of actually responding to this tells you everything you need to know, right? That the power structure exists within finance capital exclusively. The politicians aren't really in charge. They don't matter anymore, really. And they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop this, even though they could. And you know how they could do it? Yeah, if you raise your wages tomorrow, we're going to arrest you. Just very simply. Yeah, this inflation thing that you're doing, yeah, 8-10%. Yeah, forget that. You raise your wages, we're coming to your place, we're going to arrest you, put you in a prison cell. It's very, very straightforward. And why don't they do that? Because they're owned. Because they're owned. And this idea that we're going to be able to vote away the problem, no, it doesn't work that way. Radio Halifax last week, bananas were 49 cents per pound. It's been 89 cents for the longest time. Yet local apples are rising. Yep. They're going to raise the prices as, like, we're in a period of capitalism where they no longer even care about sustaining or maintaining even the system itself, right? That it is literally about extracting as much wealth out of the society as possible. And if that result is systems collapse, that's fine by them. They don't care because they don't live in the society anymore, right? They live in another society. They live somewhere else. And so for them, this is just something to siphon wealth out of as much as possible. Fully, peach tea, which always costs $1, has risen. How did inflation affect peach tea just now and not any other time? Yeah. Look, it's, and I'll say it over and over again. Like, if corporate profits were plateaued or in even a bit of a decline, then I would be like, yeah, there's something to this, right? They've got a point, right? We do all kind of need to talk about that, but that's not what's happening, right? Corporate profits are at record highs. They're obviously stealing from us. It's just an overt theft that's occurring in front of our eyes. And I'll say it again and again, right? You don't need to obey the laws of such a society, right? That as long as this continues happening, as long as we continue living in this perpetual decline, in this perpetual collapse, where our political leadership is completely incapable, you don't need to obey their laws. You don't need to obey the laws of Voldemort. You don't need to obey the laws of Darth Vader, right? That the laws only exist as threats at this point. That they aren't actually being done by consensus. That we're not actually having laws put out there by people we elect in order to govern us, right? The laws are being put out there by people who are purchased by an oligarchy in order to dominate and extract wealth from us. That's all that's happening. You don't need to obey the laws of Prince John. You don't need to obey the laws of any of these guys. So if you can do something to make yourself a little bit of coin on the side, right, you do it. Because there is no laws, you don't need to pay attention to them. Very straightforwardly. Because, I mean, and there'd be very simple ways for them to change that, right? Actually govern. Actually look at these thieves, liars, and psychopaths who are stealing from us, right? Stealing from us every single day, extracting as much wealth as they possibly can, and just say, quit it. We'll put you in prison, right? We're the government. We'll put you in prison if you keep doing this. But they're not going to do that because they work with them. And what's the result of this, right? Danielle Smith here out in Alberta wants to create a provincial police force that will oppose federal firearm legislation and report to us, right? This is from the United Conservative Party. We've got a United Conservative Party member basically saying we need to erect a provincial secret police in order to fight the federal government. We got number calls. We got number calls. We all know what that means. We all know what that means. All right. All right. We got 10 people watching. I expect to see 10 numbers in chat. All right, we got a 7, we got a 4, we got a 2, we got a 5, we got an 8.
Here we go for today's number.
I'm going with a 6.
29,
You and me, DM. Ride or die. Oh, I'm with DM. DM wins every time.
Each ball has
DM wins every time, so I feel good. Doom to bloom. Good to see you, bud.
Swirl the numbers.
Swirl the numbers. Rusty Shackelford. Good to see you, bud.
Pick a number.
Here we go. Here we go. Ligandies, you can't redact your number.
Today's number is
How dare you, sir?
6.
Hey, DM wins again. What I tell you, Rusty and me, we did it. We did it. We did it. We did it. Yeah, it's a good day. We won something. Everything worked for once. Ding, 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 ding. Remember, 3 is half of 8. That's right, DM. Thanks for reminding us. I love that joke is living on forever. Live on, silly little joke. Live on, silly little joke. The Commodore, do you guys do this every day? Yep, it's a daily number. What I think is crazy, V Commodore, like, I stumbled upon this. Because what it is it's David Lynch. I don't know if you know who David Lynch is, but David Lynch is just like this really interesting, eclectic director who, and he just does a number draw every day. And so I just thought, you know what? Let's do the daily number draw. It's so weird. Isn't it the weirdest? Like, why is he doing it? Why is he doing it? And apparently there was a moment where David Lynch thought to himself, I'm going to stop doing this number draw. And his fans were like, no, we love it. Keep doing it. And so he does it. He does it. And so it's just like, I'm in. Let's go. Yeah, David Lynch is a great director. Absolutely great director. Even when he fails, he's wonderful. Like, he's such a Twin Peaks is some of the best television you'll ever watch. That I loved the new season he did. For those who don't know, Twin Peaks was like a precursor to X-Files. And then, like, it only got, like, I think 2 seasons. And then the show got canceled. by executives, because executives, they're short-sighted idiots, and then like 20 years passes, and they do another season of Twin Peaks, and it's so odd and just like very sideways and eclectic and weird. It's exactly David Lynch. And one of my favorite things that I love about David Lynch as a director and as a storyteller is he just has a general opinion. Like, you don't need to explain things to your audience. You don't need to explain anything to your audience. You don't need to and sometimes when I watch movies, I think to myself, this would be better if they were explaining less. So you think like, what's the movie that I really use as an example for this? Oh, come on, it's the Christopher Nolan one where they do like the dream, Inception. Inception was one of these. Because Inception is full of so much exposition of like, we're going to go into their dreams and then we got to go down into the layer of the next dream and all this kind of stuff. And I always thought to myself, cut all of that exposition. Cut all of it. Do not have exposition in this film. It is unnecessary completely. Literally have them just go into the dream and just do the inception and go down the levels and all of that. Explain nothing and let the audience be confused. Let the audience look at it and be like, what? What's, and then like really let them chew on it and let them figure it out themselves, right? That's how David Lynch would do it. David Lynch would be like, yeah, you don't need to explain this to them. Yeah, you're in a dream. They're going into a dream. Dreams are confusing. People will love it. And I think they would. I think that the film would have been a lot better if they had to just cut out all that exposition. Is Jane Lynch related to David Lynch? Are Jane Lynch and David Lynch related? You know what? I'm not getting a clear answer right away, so I don't care. How about you find this out, DM? You come back on us. You let us know. I hope you guys are all doing well out there, man. I hope all of you are doing well out there. I hope you're finding love, you're finding peace, you're finding even just a moment of entertainment, even just like a moment of distraction. I'm so grateful that all of you are here in solidarity with me, and that I hope that you find some kind of catharsis, some kind of feeling of expression through this collective journey that we find ourselves on. What a wild ride this is, eh? What a wild ride this is. I think about this all the time. It's just, we're here so temporarily, and while we're here, we're just kind of dealing with the total crisis of capitalism, of climate change, the total ridiculous nonsense of it all. And I hope that you're dealing with it with grace and dignity. Hold on one second here. And light. Let there be light. You got to see this beautiful face, right? You got to see this beautiful face. I hope we get 25 people on this stream one day. It'll happen. The highest I've ever... I have hit 25 people, DM, at one point. Because it gives me all of the stuff, right? Like, it gives me all that information. So right now there's 36 views. I usually get about 50 views by the end of the stream. And I have had... Come on. Concurrent viewers. So far 11 today. That's pretty normal, right? I've had as high as 25. I think 25... I think I've actually had as high as 28 at one time. And then I've had like 150 views. So... I more or less think that viewership is going to increase after the summer ends, right? Because it's summer, dude. Like, everybody's going out and doing stuff, and it's the reason why network television doesn't run television shows over the summer, right? I expect viewership will pick up come October, November, December, January, February, March, right? We'll see. We'll see. Here's one that I wanted to read here. This is by Jamal Rich. This is from the Communist Party USA. The struggle for full legalization of our party. On the CPUSA's visible existence in national life. Before I joined the CPUSA in the spring of 2017, I had no idea that the Communist Party of the United States still existed. As someone new to the movement at the time, being only exposed to the Black Lives Matter movement following the murders of Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, Alton Sterling, and Michael Brown and others, as well as the Occupy Wall Street movement and 2016 campaign of Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary, I began to make the links between the movement for black liberation and the class struggle for socialism, concluding that more fundamental changes were needed than the reforms advocated by the Sanders campaign. Given my own ignorance of the Communist Party's existence, I am sure many unconscious workers and peoples within the mass democratic movements fighting against police violence, for abortion rights, and for other progressive causes are unaware of our party's existence, let alone its history. Some may be aware of the current growth in youth energy in the Democratic Socialists of America. Others may think that the heyday of the CPUSA was in the 1930s and 40s, but that the Communist Party is currently irrelevant or non-existent. Many new members within the party have questions about our approach to elections, wondering why we haven't run an independent national candidate since 1984 for president and vice president. A number of them are still very confused about our Popular Front approach, which includes our concept of the Communist Plus, that we add to the movement through our work in trade unions and other mass organizations. Alongside these questions about the role of the party, there are questions about its legal status. Are we a semi-legal political party or a fully legal party? Which McCarthyite-era laws still affect our ability to work openly? How do we struggle for ballot access and participate publicly in legislative affairs? How do we become a mass party representing the working class of this country, capable of widely affecting public consciousness? How do we build morale and overcome the internalized fear and red baiting that disarms us within the trade unions, within the democratic movement, and within the electoral process? William Z. Foster addresses some of these questions in Our Country Needs a Strong Communist Party. A major necessity for building our party into the mass party that we must have is to secure its full legalization, he wrote. As matters stand now, our party is only partially legal. In various areas of our political life, the Communist Party is barely tolerated, if at all. We are denied many legal rights of other parties by the government, federal, state, and city. We are not fully recognized in the ranks of the Democratic Coalition, and we are also discriminated against in the trade unions. Foster wrote this after the reinstatement of the CPUSA in 1946, which had been temporarily liquidated into the Communist Political Association in 1944 under the leadership of Earl Browder. Foster was trying to bring back the fighting spirit of the party in the aftermath of the war and liquidation. This would eventually be halted by the Deus Committee and the HUAC attacks on the party several years later, and eventually the Smith, Taft-Hartley, and Walter McCarran Acts, which targeted the CPUSA for repression, restricting, and democratic and trade union movements in the process. In light of the socialist movement, our party needs to build into an influential mass party in order to sustain and maintain its growth. In light of a growing fascist danger, we must struggle for our full legality to have a more favorable terrain to fight on. Struggling for our full legality includes 1. Fighting for ballot access, 2. Running communist candidates, 3. Fighting for our open communist leadership with mass organizations, which would include communist speakers at mass mobilizations, 4. Openly fighting for legislation through public hearings in Congress and local city councils, and 5. Fighting on legal grounds against anti-communist legislation that affects our work nationally and locally. As Foster wrote in 1946, we must legalize ourselves in legislative assemblies by appearing and testifying upon all important legislation, and by electing communists to office. In various movements and activities of the Democratic Coalition, we must let the timid or red-baiting leaders know that the communists are not going to remain in the background and do the bulk of the work and get none of the credit, but are going to insist upon recognition for what they are, frontline fighters in every battle for democracy. In the trade unions, we must insist upon our full democratic rights. Red baiting must be defeated, not only in the interest of our party, but of the whole nation. Demand it. The Communist Party must be legalized in every sense of the word. We have to have enough influence that the working class and the nationally oppressed know we are fighting for their interest, not that the ruling capitalist class like the Democratic and Republican parties do. The Communist Party needs to become part of the national life of the country, which, with mass influence in all social, political, and economic spheres of U.S. life. We need to struggle for representation and leadership in city councils, school boards, mayoral offices, public library boards, museum boards, academic boards, trade union caucuses, neighborhood committees, tenant associations, in every social institution we can think of. By building mass support around local bases in the neighborhoods, shop floors, and campuses, each party district can create the political pressure needed to fight for necessary reforms in their communities, universities, and workplaces. This, in turn, could lead to legislative fights for party-led ballot initiatives and city council resolutions, all while training the next generation of a fighting party leadership. Comrades in the party, old and new, need to develop a mass approach throughout each district. Each section of potential influence should be studied and looked at. The party needs to be visible and influential in everyday life. Simple things like writing an opinion column or letter to the editor of a local newspaper can be a start. Clubs should be taking up frontline positions in the fight against racism by building mass organizations in their communities, like a branch of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. They should be playing a leading role in the battle of ideas against monopoly and reaction by building working-class institutions, Marxist and popular education schools, or worker centers to help those in need. Examples of this idea include the Claudia Jones School for Political Education in Washington, D.C., and the People's Center in New Haven, CT. Clubs should be building infrastructure locally so they can be visible in their communities, purchasing a community building, renting an office space, hiring an organizer, developing a People's World paper route in the community, or developing multimedia for educational purposes and journalistic efforts. CPUSA members need to stop comparing ourselves to other third parties in this country. We are not the Green Party. We are not the variety of Trotskyite parties. We are not the Working Families Party. Locally, we should be thinking about our relationship to these parties, but fully understand our independence as a communist party. When Peter Kakian won a seat on the New York City Council in 1941 on the communist ticket, that was the work of the party-led mass movement. When Ben Davis Jr. won another seat on the New York City Council a few years later on the American Labor Party ticket, this was a result of the CPUSA's influence among the barrios in Harlem and the black and Jewish communities. These electoral victories served as a precursor developments to Henry Wallace's campaign for president of the U.S. on the Progressive Party ticket, which enjoyed the full support of the CPUSA. How do we reproduce this type of work in our local communities? Fighting for the full legalization of the party is important to the development of the anti-monopoly coalition. Henry Winston wrote in The Politics of People's Action, the Communist Party in the 72 elections, we must be able to arouse the nation to a hatred of the monopoly, racism, exploitation, aggression, and war. To do it requires improving in every way the role of vanguard. We should not continually play defense, solely fighting to maintain the democratic rights we fought long and hard for. Our class is looking for an offensive strategy, which will require the unity of our multinational, multiracial, multigender, multigenerational working class. Our strategic and tactical approaches to developing an offensive fight against monopoly are extremely important. A strong anti-monopoly alliance must be built on the basis of an all-people's front against the fascist danger seeded by Trumpism and the January 6th insurrection. Building this coalition and uniting these forces will require a strong Communist Party that is functioning legally and out in the open. A full-blown fascist dictatorship does not exist in the United States, and the basis for our party to grow and build mass influence still exists. Like other communist parties around the world which are functioning legally in non-fascist countries, we strive to use every avenue of peaceful, democratic, and legal struggle in our fight for socialism. Communist parties who have mass influence, have open party members in parliament, and participate popular in the electorate are better able to get their ideas to the public. We need to struggle harder for our legality and our independence as a political party here in the United States, and that means fighting for political office. As Elizabeth Gurley Flynn noted in her Smith Act trial in 1952, we will prove to you that the Communist Party, USA, is not, as the indictment sets forth, a society or group or assembly of persons, but as a legitimate political party. It has nominated candidates for all public offices, including that of president. Our party has never been outlawed, although measures have been taken by the federal government to curtail its influence, by making party members register as foreign agents, generating mass lists of communist fronts, leading to the dissolution of mass organizations, public red baiting, removing communists from leadership in CIO unions, deporting communists who were not U.S. citizens, and other repressive measures. During the first Red Scare in 1919 and following years in which the U.S. government particularly targeted the industrial workers of the world, our party went underground as the Workers' Party and was raided, along with the Wobblies and the Palmer raids. During the second Red Scare in the 1950s, party leadership again went underground and destroyed their membership lists. At this time, COINTELPRO was targeting communists for arrest, deportation, job loss, and ongoing harassment. The party survived this difficult period, but is still recovering from the political repression. This recovery has been tough. The after effects of FBI infiltration and repression can still be felt. Ideological splits and confusion generated by circumstances of the following period, the Sino-Soviet split, the Hungarian crisis, the New Left movements emerging, the rise of Reaganism and Gorbachev's leadership in the USSR, the fall of the USSR, and subsequent split within the CPUSA, all continue to have their impact. A large part of the U.S. working class consists of immigrant workers from Latin America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Immigrants are a major and often progressive component of our working class. Many come to our countries as refugees of war-ravaged countries under the gun of U.S. imperialism. The CPUSA was founded in part by immigrant workers of different nationalities from Europe, and later a large set of Afro-descendants from the Caribbean. Claudia Jones was a Trinidadian immigrant and leader of the party's Women's Commission. Ferdinand Smith was a leading Jamaican national in the National Maritime Union. Both were deported under McCarran and Smith Acts. During this period, Congress also passed discriminatory laws against immigrants seeking citizenship for being communist or suspected communists. Fight for the full legalization of the party, therefore, is part and parcel of fighting for the full democratic rights of all immigrants to join the Communist Party without fear of retaliation, whether from the U.S. government, employers, landlords, or anyone else. The party should incorporate the fight for immigrants' rights into the work of the building of the local NAARPR branches throughout the country. The NAARPR is meant to be a mass defense organization, following the historic lineage of the Civil Rights Congress and the International Labor Defense. It aims to bring together legal experts, movement lawyers, and community organizers to both provide legal protection for vulnerable communities and to strengthen the fight back. NAARPR branches and other organizations around the country have been fighting against ICE and other immigration enforcement agencies and for the expansion of the democratic rights of immigrants, including the right to vote in local elections, regardless of immigration status. There is, first of all, the necessity of helping to establish that kind of a committee which will bring together communists and non-communists on a national scale, who will lead in the fight for the legality of the Communist Party, organize the campaign to get the party on the ballot. Such a battle will include the concept in many areas of urging civil libertarians and others to start the anti-communist laws in the majority of states in the country. Henry Winston, The Politics of People's Action. Fighting to get our party back on the ballot is a legal, democratic fight that needs to be prioritized as we continue to build our party in this new period. Utilizing united front approaches to working class issues will assist our comrades in this fight. If political parties like the Green Party and the Libertarian Party can have ballot access in most states, then why can't we? What are the laws preventing us from doing so? If the Communist Party is to be part of the national life of the country, then we need to be seen nationwide on every county, district, state, and national ballot. This is a difficult task, and one that will not be accomplished overnight, but it is one that needs to be studied by each party district to see what strategic and tactical approach is realistic. Petitioning to get the Communist Party on the ballot will be a difficult task. Remaining on the ballot for following elections will be even more difficult, given existing electoral restrictions and our lack of financial resources as a working class party. But if our comrades in Europe and elsewhere can fight for political power, then we should be able to do so too. The maximum of concentration and the mass exercise of ingenuity must be brought into play in a defense of democracy, Winston urged in The Politics of People's Action, which begins with the ballot rights of the communists. This fight may begin at the local level by developing close working relations with progressive forces operating under the Democratic Party umbrella. One example of this might be the Working Families Party, which works directly with progressives within the Democratic Party and also runs independent candidate slates in Pennsylvania and New York. Building an electoral base of independent candidates for nonpartisan office may also be a route, like running candidates for advisory neighborhood commissioner in Washington, D.C. However, we must be careful of opportunists. Frustration with the old two parties has led to the creation of a new centrist party, headed by former presidential candidate Andrew Yang. Called the Forward Party, it is attracting technocratic fascists and right-wing libertarians. The Movement for a People's Party is just another opportunistic outfit, led by Jimmy Dore and other racist and sexist cult-like YouTubers who are proponents of a certain brand of fascism that uses Marxist language. They're talking about the the patriotic socialists. Our goal is to build a mass movement with working class leadership, to build left-center unity, leading to a progressive People's Party with mass influence. We will need to work within the trade union movement and unite all forces in the struggle against racism, the struggle for gender equality, and other mass democratic movements. It is a twofold struggle. One, building confidence within the working class to be independent of the two old parties and to begin to build a new, popular, anti-monopoly party. And two, building confidence in our own party to run its own independent candidates and put our own program forward into the national life of the country. Let us not forget communists like C. Gearson, who received over 100,000 votes on the Communist City Council ballot line in Brooklyn, New York, or Gus Hall, who, in his 1980 presidential election campaign with Angela Davis, received near 45,000 votes, or Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who gathered over 50,000 votes in 1942 for Congress at large. Over 600,000 people cast votes for Bernadette Doyle in 1950 for statewide superintendent of public instruction in California. Jarvis Tyner received over 11,000 votes in 1978 for New York governor. Over 33,000 people voted for Claude Lightfoot in 1933 for Illinois state legislature, and the list goes on. Fighting for our popularity. The fight for the Communist Party's popularity is an important fight and requires the confidence of our members. Fighting for its full legality will also increase party morale. In the fight for popularity, we have to present ourselves in the professional and disciplined manner in every social economic and political sphere we find ourselves in, and be confident enough to present our program publicly. This requires mass education within the party itself, and a special role for clubs and developing a clearer understanding of the party's program. In the multimedia sphere, the party needs to present itself as a visible and viable alternative to the two old parties and overcome the perception of it as a fringe political party. Our confidence and morale will be shown to the masses of people through our work in the labor movement, in the oppressed communities, on the campuses, and elsewhere. Our confidence and morale will be shown when the communities that we perform our work in put our party members in leadership positions, showing their desire to have our party represent them in legislative fights or in political office. Our popularity will grow as we take the lead in political campaigns, resulting in victories for these communities, whether they be campaigns around a particular issue or a particular communist candidate. These results can come about through the fight for legality. It is a struggle we must take on. This gives us kind of a sense of how the communists are currently doing in the United States. We know that communists have been persecuted and blown up. We know that the Communist Party has been fought against, legally and illegally. We know that the communists are trying to rebuild. And we can see the public through the patriotic socialist movement, which I'll talk more about. We can see the struggle of the populace to come to grips with the idea of communism and the desire to maintain old iconography and ideas from American empire, right? That's about something that the patriotic socialists are all about. Ben Norton is the man who's completely responsible in a single tweet. Because for a long time I've been sitting here saying, I don't necessarily agree with the patriotic socialists, but I understand where the patriotic socialists are coming from. That I understand the desire to maintain and keep hold of the things that you perceive as good within your culture. And I understand that desire of attempting to merge those ideals or that idea with Marxist and communist thinking. I think it makes a type of sense. It makes a type of emotional sense, right? It doesn't necessarily have an intellectual consistency. I think that that's definitely always been true and something I've always said. But I do think that it maintains a type of emotional sense, that it emotionally it resonates. Ben Norton changed my mind in a single tweet where he said, most people across the world view the American flag the way that the Nazi flag is viewed. And I thought to myself, that's very true. If you live in Vietnam, if you live across the Middle East, if you live in these countries, you don't look at the American flag and think to yourself, oh, there's a misunderstood group, or there's something that can be reclaimed, right? And then of course Ben Norton goes on and says, you cannot reclaim the American flag. And that's exactly right. You can't reclaim the Nazi flag. You can't reclaim the Confederate flag. You can't reclaim these things because they're done. They can't be reformed. They stand for what they stand for. That if a white guy started walking around flying a Nazi flag saying, we're going to reclaim the Nazi flag, you would think to yourself, that guy's just a Nazi. Well, similarly, the American flag and the American iconography and the Founding Fathers and all of this, they cannot be reclaimed. That to the vast majority of the world's population, the American flag is on the same level as the Nazi flag. And this is the hard reality that the patriotic socialists do not want to accept. And it is why, fundamentally, the patriotic socialist movement must fail. that it won't actually reclaim that really, in essence, what they are attempting to try to maintain is the fascism of America by creating a veneer of communism. And it simply won't work. That the only way forward for American communists is the full admission that America has always been a fascist nation, that the rest of the world views America as a fascist nation, and if we are to move away from that and become something better than that, we're not going to do that by merging ourselves with the iconography of the American empire. You can't reform it. It can't be reformed. And fundamentally, that's what the patriotic socialists are attempting to do. They are attempting to reform the unreformable, which is why their worldview is incoherent, and it's why their ideas cannot work. That fundamentally, that's where I've come to with the patriotic socialists. I still do understand the emotional desire to do so. It makes sense on that emotional level, but the rationale no longer functions. It doesn't work. It simply doesn't work, and it won't work. Because what will happen is if a patriotic socialist movement begins to gain steam, it will be co-opted by fascists. That's what will happen. And you can't negotiate with these guys. You can't negotiate with Nazis. You can't negotiate with fascists. It's not possible, right? If you're a Nazi, if you're a fascist, right, you communicate exclusively and you understand the world exclusively through violence. That is the method of your communication. There is no such thing as egalitarianism. There is no such thing as community. There is no such thing as any of that. There is only what you can get away with by using force. That's how Nazis communicate. That's how fascists communicate. And if you are attempting to take communist ideas and merging those two together, then the fascists will just destroy it, which is exactly what I expect to see. The CPUSA and the PATSOX are separate entities, correct. And I think that there was a moment where Caleb Maupin was trying to get into the CPUSA, but I don't think it worked out. And now, especially what with the whole sex pest situation going on with Caleb Maupin, that's done, I think. For those of you who don't know, there have been allegations that have come out against Caleb Maupin of him actively manipulating young women to get them into sexual situations. And some of the stuff that I've seen has been extremely damning. Like it's not simply a series of misunderstandings. It's not like it's very predatory, is how I would describe it. Right? It's definitely changed my position and my opinion on Caleb Maupin. Like it's not like, oh, I asked this girl out and she said yes, and then we had a weird sex experience, and then it kind of got weird, right? Like, normal shit, right? It's literally like putting a young lady in a position where she loses her job and then actively working to get her into sex trade, kind of shit that we're talking about. And it's so I just don't think the PATSOX. I think that whole thing's over. I think that for a long time I've extended a bit of an olive branch towards them, or wanted to give them leeway. I don't think we can do that anymore. Yeah. Like, and don't though, Generation Y Me. Like, don't feel so bad for having supported those people, right? Like, one of the things I used to say about the patriotic socialist was, you gotta let new movements. Like, you don't point at a baby when it's trying to stand up and it falls off an ass and go, ha, ha, dumbass baby, what an idiot baby, right? That's not what you do, right? You understand that it's trying to get up on its feet and it's trying to do something, and it's gonna look clumsy and stupid and make mistakes and all this, right? And that was always sort of my position with the patriotic socialists, but now I've come to the point where I've seen that, like, no, they are not trying to, that's not what they're trying to do. They're not a young organization that's making mistakes. They are a young organization, but I'm seeing a lot of predatory behavior, and I'm seeing and that predatory behavior is rooted in their desire to maintain the empire, which is fundamentally what they're trying to do, right? So in the end, they're trying to use Marxism as a Trojan horse in order to get people to buy into the idea that we can reform the empire while maintaining the empire. That's fundamentally what the patriotic socialists are saying. And Generation Y Me, I don't think you should feel bad for having gone along with it or taken a look at it with a kinder eye, because I know I did. I know I did for a long time, and in many ways, I'll be straight with you guys. In many ways, I'm still quite sympathetic. I am sympathetic to young men who are frustrated and want to kind of maintain what they believe to be the positive aspects of their own culture. Of course, I'm sympathetic to that on an emotional level. On an emotional level, yeah. Hey, Base, how you doing? Let's say your name properly. Astiv Base Quasifaful Base. Welcome. Good to see you. Ligon D says, I've not been very hard on these guys because they were speaking out against the Uyghur genocide narrative. Not enough people are speaking out. Yes, exactly, right? And there are positions that they were taking that I could look at and be like, oh yeah, like I agree. I tend to agree. But at its fundamental base, when you get down to the very bottom of it, right? And you actually get into like, what is this organization trying to accomplish? Fundamentally, what they are trying to accomplish is a reform. That's really ultimately what they're trying to do. That the empire itself is actually good. It just needs reform. Can't be reformed. You can't reform Darth Vader's empire. You can't reform Voldemort's Death Eaters. You can't reform these types of dark, evil organizations that exist. That we are attempting to build new systems, and these new systems need to be used in place of. And what we need more than anything right now, is a mass movement to surround the halls of power and make it so that it is understood that the oligarchy no longer has control, the oligarchy no longer has power, and we are no longer abiding by the rules of the oligarchy. That is fundamentally what needs to be done. I mean, I'm more or less of the opinion that we need to essentially completely dismantle the banking system, the financial sector completely. It's just a parasite that serves no purpose whatsoever. Just keeps us enthralled to this idea of money, this fake, who gives a shit about it? Like, why are we sacrificing our entire lives for little pieces of paper? What are you talking about? It's so dumb, and the more you think about it, the dumber it gets. And yet we do it every single day. We're in the middle of a climate change catastrophe, right? We're reporting on that today for anybody who's come in, right? We're in the middle of a climate change catastrophe, and we all just keep going to work. We all just keep waking up and going to work so that we can get these little pieces of paper to pay rent to who? Landlords, who do nothing of value whatsoever. Just fucking ticket scalpers, right? So we need to organize along those lines. And the one thing that I would be interested in talking to members of the Communist Party in the USA about is, like, at what point do you actually start saying that the electoral system that you're attempting to organize in itself has lost credibility, that it has lost the right to govern and the right to rule? I think that the American and Canadian systems are already there. I think that the oligarchy has already overwhelmed them to such a degree that, like, if a communist was to gain prominence in the United States, they would shut that person down in serious ways too. Like, it wouldn't just be like a legislative coup. Like, they will assassinate people. They have assassinated people in the past. And the idea that they're not going to pursue those, I think, is foolishness. Of course they're going to. Of course they're going to. They do not want communists to gain national prominence. And they are not going to permit communists into the electoral system. And so while I value this desire to funnel energy into the electoral system, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? I would say very much that the true success of a communist movement is going to be in the streets, is going to be as revolutionaries first. Because here's a great example of what I'm talking about, right? So here is when refusing voluntary overtime can get you arrested, right? This is something that happened in Alberta, right? Memorandum to alum Safeway scaffolders. Cease and desist coordinated or overtime refusals. For the last 3 days, scaffolders have refused to work overtime beyond their 10-hour shifts at the Suncor base plant site and have refused to accept overtime shifts offered for the weekends, Friday to Sunday, on both night and day shifts. We have been patient and given your union an opportunity to convince you that this coordinated refusal constitutes an illegal strike and that you may face consequences as a result. Obviously, this has not worked. The Court/Labor Board order. Today we appeared in front of the Labor Relations Board. The board has issued an order finding that scaffolders have threatened a strike regarding the weekend work and 12-hour shift requests and have engaged in a strike or job action by coordinated refusal to work overtime. The board is directing all such activity cease and that employees are prohibited from their coordinated efforts to refuse overtime in order to secure incentives. The board ruled that refusing to work voluntarily, I love that it's voluntary, in quotation marks, overtime, is an unlawful strike and in violation of the Labor Relations Code when it is done as here by a group of employees acting together. A copy of this order will be circulated today to our locations at Suncor and Syncrude and will be posted on these sites. The order is also being entered as an order of the court, which can impact those who act in defiance of this order. Consequences for employees who refuse to work overtime as a group in violation of this order include discipline or termination of employees for this conduct, alum Safeway hiring ban for those who continue to engage in illegal activities, legal action against striking employees for all damages caused by the illegal strikes by grievance or lawsuit. You could be personally liable for added production costs, penalties owing to owner, or even the loss of the contract with our client. Contempt of court proceedings for violation of the order entered by the court, the possibility of fines, and even potentially jail. We also expect that the owner will be very upset with striking employees. It is possible that the owner would consider a site ban for those involved. We do not want to impose any of the consequences set out above. This memo is intended to cause you to change your behavior by impressing upon you the seriousness of this matter, including the consequences that you may suffer if the strike continues. We expect you to comply with the order and cease your illegal activities. Overtime is required, and we expect you to behave lawfully and take this work as you normally would. The good news. We cannot accept the past and ongoing unlawful actions of our staff in refusing overtime. That is not the lawful or honorable way of achieving our aims. This is why we are required to take legal action. However, Alumma Safeway values and respects its employees and appreciates the commitment of its employees to our success. We have heard your concerns regarding incentives and been working with our clients tirelessly to address these issues in a meaningful way. We are confident that we will have good news shortly so we can reward our hard-working employees of our great team. I honestly and sincerely look forward to being able to share news very shortly, and thank you all for your commitments and work on behalf of our company in a challenging and important work environment. I look forward to writing to you all soon. Sincerely, Ken Sandmoan, Area VP, Northern Region. Rob Momborquet, Managing Director, Canada. This is what we're up against. When refusing voluntary or overtime can get you arrested, fined, jailed, a criminal record, being personally liable for millions in costs and loss of contract, and even blackballed from the industry, it isn't voluntary overtime, it's indentured slavery. Correct. By definition. Welcome to Canada. Welcome to Canada. This is why I scoff at people when they say just get a better job. These are the people you end up working for. This is what Canada is like. This is it. Right here. Work your life away for us while we underpay you. And if you organize in any way, we'll just send our lawyers at you. Right? And it doesn't matter even if they're legally correct, honestly. When you have billions and billions of dollars at your disposal, you can crush this kind of thing, right? You can destroy these kinds of people. Yeah, this is like some mafia stuff, absolutely. That's the whole point. The whole point is to terrify people, right? Because we live in a terrorist society, right? We live in a society that uses violence and terrorism on its own citizens regularly. And I consider this to be normal. This is how things normally are. This type of letter isn't unusual. Maybe normal's not the right word to use, but it's typical. Typical is the word to use. This is just typical Canadian shit. Why don't you go get a better job? Because I don't want to be a slave. Very, 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 very simply put. Why just get a better job and be a slave? No, thanks. Not interested. And also not terribly interested in working for a society that's actively attempting to destroy the species. Right? Yeah, they'll come for those better jobs eventually too. Absolutely. Absolutely. Right? All right. Let's close all this stuff down. I'm going to keep this one living. So, let's do a bit of a pivot. Oh, hey, first things first. Ads inserted. Ukraine says it has begun. See, you can see. Check it out. Look, views, 47, right? So since the last time we looked, we've had a bunch of people take a look. Only 5 viewers in the chat right now, but that's pretty typical too. So how you guys doing? Glad to see you. Let's have a little bit of a chat. Ukraine says it has begun counteroffensive to retake Russian-held south. Right? Ukraine, August 29th. Ukraine announced on Monday the start of a long-awaited counteroffensive to retake territory in the south seized by Russian forces since their invasion 6 months ago. A move reflecting Kiev's growing confidence as Western military aid flows in. The news came as a team from the UN nuclear watchdog headed to Ukraine to inspect the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, captured by Russian forces in March, but still run by Ukrainian staff. That has become a hotspot in the war. Moscow and Kiev have traded accusations of shelling in the vicinity of the nuclear plant, Europe's largest and close to front lines amid fear of a radiation disaster in a country still haunted by the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. Today we started offensive actions in various directions, including the Kherson region. Ukrainian public broadcaster Suspilin cited Northern Command spokeswoman Natalia Humeniuk as saying, Russia rapidly captured swaths of Ukraine's south near the Black Sea coast, including the city of Kherson, in an early phase of the war in stark contrast to its failed attempt to capture the capital, Kiev. Ukraine has been using sophisticated Western-supplied weapons to hit Russian ammunition dumps and wreak havoc with supply lines. Humeniuk told a briefing on Monday that Ukraine had struck more than 10 such ammunition dumps in the past week, adding they had unquestionably weakened the enemy. She declined to give details of the counteroffensive, saying Russian forces in southern Ukraine remained quite powerful. The governor of Ukraine's Russian-annexed Crimea Peninsula, Sergei Askionov, dismissed her announcement as another fake of Ukrainian propaganda. Crimea is adjacent to the Kherson region. Russia's RIA news agency, quoting local official Vladimir Leontiev, reported that people were being evacuated from workplaces in Nova Kayovka, a town 58 kilometers to the east of Kherson, after Ukrainian forces carried out more than 10 missile strikes there. Nuclear safety. Earlier, the head of the International Atomic Agency said he would lead a team of inspectors this week to the Zazovskoye plant on the Dnipro River in northern central Ukraine, without specifying the expected day of their arrival. We must protect the safety and security of Ukraine's and Europe's biggest nuclear facility, Rafael Grossi said in a post on Twitter. The IAEA tweeted separately that the mission would assess physical damage, evaluate the conditions in which staff are working at the plant, and determine functionality of safety and security systems. It would also perform urgent safeguard activities, a reference to keep track of nuclear material. On Monday, Russian-installed officials said a Ukrainian missile strike had punched a hole in the roof of a fuel depot at the Zaporizhzhia plant. Russia's defense ministry said its forces had shot down a Ukrainian drone that was trying to attack the nuclear power station, Russian news agencies reported. It said there was no serious damage and radiation levels were normal. Reuters could not independently verify either report. The Kremlin said the IAEA mission was necessary and urged the international community to pressure Ukraine to reduce military tensions at the plant. The United Nations, the United States, and Ukraine have called for a withdrawal of military equipment and personnel from the nuclear complex to ensure it is not a target. But the Kremlin again ruled out vacating the site. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said the IAEA mission must carry out its work in a politically neutral manner. They must be objective, she told Rosia 24 television channel. Russian forces fired at Enerhodar, the Dnipro riverside town where the plant is located, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky's chief of staff said on Sunday in his Telegram channel alongside a video of firefighters dousing burning cars. They provoke and try to blackmail the world, Andriy Yermak said. Lilia Valina, 22, among a growing number of refugees from Enerhodar arriving in Ukraine-held city of Zaporozhye. I can't pronounce this word. Zaporizhzhia. Some 50 kilometers upriver from the plant, said she hoped the IAEA mission would lead to a demilitarization of the area. I think they will stop the bombing, she told Reuters. 2 of the plant's reactors were cut off from the electrical grid last week due to shelling. Every shell matters. In the Donetsk region of eastern Ukraine, Russian forces shelled military and civilian infrastructure near Bakhmut, Shumy, Yakovlivka, Zaitsevo, and Kodeme, the Ukraine's military said on Monday. Russian strikes killed 8 civilians in Donetsk province on Sunday, its governor, Pavlo Kriklenko, said. Moscow denies targeting civilians. Russia calls its actions in Ukraine a special military operation to demilitarize its southern neighbor. Ukraine, which won independence when the Russian-dominated Soviet Union broke up in 1991, and its Western allies have dismissed this as a baseless pretext for a war of conquest. The invasion of Ukraine has touched off Europe's most devastating conflict since World War II. Thousands of people have been killed, billions displaced, and cities blasted to ruins. The war has also threatened the global economy with an energy and food supply crisis. On Monday, Zelensky accused Russia of trying to prevent European nations from filling their gas storage facilities enough to cope with the coming winter. Sweden, which along with Finland plans to join NATO in response to Russia's invasion, announced nearly $50 million worth of additional military aid to Ukraine on Monday, during a visit to Stockholm by Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. Kuleba urged Sweden to provide weapons such as howitzers and shells. Every euro, every bullet, every shell matters, he said. Germany will also send more arms to Ukraine in coming weeks and help upgrade Kiev's artillery and air defense capacities, Chancellor Olaf Scholz told a conference in Prague, where he also reaffirmed German support for Ukraine and several other ex-Soviet republics to join the European Union. Major says, RT reported Ukraine's counteroffensive attempt has failed. Russia today. So it didn't go well. I mean, this is the thing that we need, like, Western media needs to prevent or send articles like this into the atmosphere. It's trying to convince the public that there is actually a fight going on where one doesn't actually exist, right? That what we are seeing is not really like is not really like it's a conflict, certainly. Like there's shots fired, certainly. But like Ukraine's not going to gain territory. Like that's the hard truth. Like that's the straightforward reality of what's actually happening. Like the Russians have taken the territory that I think they want to take. Maybe they'll expand a little bit further in, right? Especially to get into get all of the Donbass region, right? Probably push to the river. But like Ukraine's not getting that territory back. Like that's not happening. And so, but you need to convince people that it is possible that Ukraine is going to actually launch a successful counteroffensive and a successful counterattack to reclaim territory. Because you've got to keep the populace involved in the idea that this is an actual fight that's going on. When really what we're seeing is we're seeing Russia just sort of dusting it up at this point, right? That it's less a military attack and a military advancement and more a solidifying of territory and solidifying of borders. That what Russia wants to do, or certainly what it's always signaled it wants to do, is it wants to make the Donbass region an independent region and absorb Crimea. And so the idea that that Ukraine is going to launch some kind of counteroffensive that's actually going to be successful, it's not going to happen. Russia has air superiority and air supremacy, right? It has the territory that it wants to claim. It's setting up administrative power, right? And very shortly it will just start acting that way, right? That eventually the territory of Donbass will elect its own people. It will begin acting the way that it is, and then eventually over time more and more foreign powers will begin to acknowledge the independence of the Donbass region, right? And eventually it'll just become understood that the Donbass region it's an independent region or a vassal, right, of the Russians, more or less. And Ukraine, what Ukraine has to say about it is not going to be that important, right? And so many of the weapons they talk about sending are only promised. Those arms deals just don't come into action overnight. Well, and we also have lots of evidence to show that a lot of these arms don't make it to the front line, right? That they're just being funneled into Ukraine and then they just end up on the black market, right? So they invariably end up in the hands of, like, if you ask me, it's like the CIA basically just takes these items and uses them in their own, bullshit shadow proxy nonsense throughout the Middle East and throughout the rest of the world. So a lot of these arms are not actually making it to the front line in the first place. Not that anybody is trained to use them, right? Like, just earlier, I think it was you, Major, was saying that, like, they're sending lots of personnel. Lots of Ukrainians are going to the front line, but they're not trained, right? So they're just fodder. And so it's just this absolute bloodletting that's happening in Ukraine right now, where Ukrainians are just throwing themselves against this wall of Russian power. And it's a war of attrition at this point, and the Ukrainians are losing. It's as straightforward as that. And there's nothing on the cards. Like, at this point, there's only two things that could change the course of what is happening. Thing number one, the West could actually begin funneling troops, right? If the West actually began funneling troops into the region, that would escalate the situation, but it would change the situation. Thing number two, nuclear war, right? And nuclear war is the end of civilization. It's the end of the human species. So, if you don't see any of those two things happening, then it is very simple that Russia is winning the war in Ukraine. It is setting up the independent Donbass. The reason why it's not plowing across all of Ukraine and taking all of the territory and doing this, because it doesn't want to. It's not interested in that territory, right? That Russia has been very conscious. Like, one of the things that very much surprised Westerners about the Ukrainian war, about the Donbass war, is that the Russians didn't just go in and destroy everything, right? Like, when the Americans go in, they go in and they level cities, right? That's how the Americans fight. They go into Iraq, they go into Afghanistan, they go into these places and they level cities. They just shock and awe everything and just blow it all up, right? The Russians didn't do that. The Russians didn't go in and level everything. That Kiev right now is relatively peaceful, right? Their infrastructure isn't completely leveled. They're not living in rubble, right, in Kiev. And this is because, and the Russians have been very straightforward about this, is that they're not interested in doing that. They're not interested in leveling Ukraine. They're not interested in creating just a country of rubble, right? They want to claim the territory that they want to claim. They want the Donbass region to be an independent region. They don't want Ukraine to be part of NATO. They want Ukraine to be this sort of neutral territory. So, and they just keep saying it over and over and over again. Like, at some point, you got to look at it and be like, yeah, like, what they're saying and what they're doing seem to align, right? And at this point, the West is just attempting to bleed the Russians. That's the only reason they're lengthening this out. They want to turn it into the same situation that was going on in Afghanistan, right? Back in the 80s. They want to bleed the Russians out. There is a difference, though, right? There's a difference between what happened in Afghanistan and what is happening in Ukraine. Because in Afghanistan, the Russians weren't particularly welcome, right? They couldn't necessarily claim territory and keep that and attempt to ever believe that territory would be internally peaceful. But there was always somebody within the ranks always coming up. Whereas in the Donbass, the Russians are relatively accepted there, right? That people actually did view them as liberators. People were actually like, oh, good, the Russians are here, right? Like, so there's a lot more of that attitude going around. And so I think that it's going to be more successful than what happened in Afghanistan. But that's not changing the Americans' position, that they see this as a way to weaken Russia, and they don't care if it means thousands and thousands of Ukrainians need to die for it. They're fine with that, right? The empire is completely fine with that. And what's the result, right? Is this backfire. There's a complete backfire going on across Europe. German economy minister says bitter reality is Russia will not resume gas supply. Germany faces the bitter reality that Russia will not restore gas supplies to the country, the German economy minister said on Monday, ahead of a planned halt by state energy giant Gazprom of exports to Europe via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. It won't come back. It is the bitter reality, Robert Habeck said in a panel with European Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen. Russia will halt natural gas supplies to Europe for 3 days at the end of the month for unscheduled maintenance to the Nord Stream pipeline, Gazprom said on Friday, piling pressure on the region as it seeks to refuel ahead of winter. Already, Russia has only been supplying 20% of the usual capacity of the Nord Stream 1 link from Russia to Germany. It was not immediately possible to clarify whether Habeck meant the outage would be permanent or just that full supplies would not resume. So this is a complete backfire, right? Enjoy that winter. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. How long do you think the Germans are going to tolerate that? How long do you think the Germans are going to live in this sort of situation where they're freezing like this? How much how much do you think the Germans are going to tolerate this kind of political incompetence, right? Because that is what they're experiencing, and this is a complete blowback that the Europeans seem to have not expected at all. They seem completely like, yeah, we'll just alienate Russia, we'll completely antagonize them, provoke them into a war, right? And they'll just keep the gas flowing, right? They'll never shut the gas off, right? Like, it's complete hubris. It's just hubris what we're seeing at this point. And I suspect we'll see a lot of political unrest over it. And historically speaking, political unrest in Germany can be catastrophically bad. I bet people will burn down some buildings trying to make fires to keep warm, yeah? Or at least gut them. Germany could get over themselves and just open Nord Stream 2 with Russia. Well, that would mean that they would have to go against the United States, right? Like, that's really what's going on here, is that the United States doesn't want that to happen. Because the United States wants to keep the NATO countries on the hook. It's not interested in allowing some kind of energy independence or some kind of a path for Europeans to actually take care of themselves, right? It wants to keep the European nations on the hook. And one of the ways it's obviously choosing to do that is by sacrificing Europeans, right? Like, the Americans are willing to sacrifice their own citizens. We learned that through the COVID period, right? It's absolutely willing to sacrifice its own people. It's never ever, it's for sure going to allow European people to freeze. It's for sure going to allow these people to go out into the cold. Yep, a fellow student had a 400 euro gas bill, which forced him to get kicked out. I mean, this is becoming more and more common, right? We are seeing, I had a story here. Oh, come on, I'm the best. Yeah. Rents are so high that students are living in homeless shelters. Like, it's becoming more and more obvious, isn't it? Like, it's becoming more and more obvious that the death cult simply doesn't care. It doesn't even care about its own citizens. It doesn't care about its own citizens. It certainly doesn't care about the citizens of other countries, right? Like, we are literally creating systems that are actively abandoning the citizenry of the countries, actively, on purpose. And there are people within the country whose response is, oh, well, just suck it up. That's what they're saying. Just suck it up, work harder, grind set, right? So literally what they do is they vote for people to dismantle the society and dismantle the system. And then when the negative outcomes to doing that occur, homelessness, poverty, they spend more on cops than they were spending on the social services in the first place in order to go beat those people up. Like, we are a culture that is turning to a psychotic bullying structure. Very straightforwardly. Very straightforwardly. That the oligarchy and the simps of capital are outright willing to spend more in order to erect a fascist system. Like, this is the true dark heart of what is going on in our civilization and what's going on in our society. The true dark heart. And the thing that I keep talking about, and the thing that I pound on all the time, and I never hear anyone else actually talking about this, is that we live in a society that is structuring itself to increase the amount of wealth that it takes in, to increase the amount that the government uses, to increase the level of public spending in order to beat up people that exist because their services were cut in the first place. That is what is actually happening in our society and in our culture. That we're increasing the amount of military expenditure, we're increasing the amount of police expenditure, while gutting the public sector. And that forces us to increase the tax burden on the taxpayer in the first place. And that seems completely rational and normal to these psychopaths. And what do they say after they do all of that? You got to bootstrap yourself, right? You got to pull yourself up. You got to fight for yourself. I'm not responsible for taking care of you, right? That's the kind of stuff that they're starting to say. So it's just psychopathic bullying at this point. And it's going to get way, way worse as the society completely fails and falls in on itself. Hi, Isaac. How you doing? Poland is asking people to store wood. Germany said, don't worry, we'll use community centers to come and warm up. And Spain said, just get more blankets. Yeah. Lots of political upheaval coming in Europe. It's going to be huge political upheaval. People are not going to tolerate this. Yeah. Canada will be a fascist nation, full stop. Let chaos reign. I expect Ford to dismantle OHIP in 2 years and implement full privatization in Ontario. That seems to be the goal, right? That does seem to be the goal. And it just looks like everybody's going along with it, right? Like, that's really the truth of it. It just looks like everybody's kind of just going along with it. And just being like, yeah, okay, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Go on strike. Fight back, right? The society is collapsing. And it's collapsing in big and serious ways. And we're all just watching it occur. And crazily, we're spending more for it. Right? Like that's part of that's the biggest part of the grift. Is that they say that it's going to be cheaper to do it this way. No, it isn't. Like black and white. No, it's not. Like 2 + 2 equals cucumber is their argument. Like really, this is what they're saying to us. 2 + 2 equals kumquat. And it's like, no, it isn't. 2 + 2 equals 4. And if you say that, they go, oh, you're just trying to cancel me. Well, yeah, honestly, I am trying to cancel people who are walking around saying 2 + 2 equals kumquat. Like, they're speaking in this gaslighting, non-rational, completely disconnected from reality kind of way. And if you stand up and point that out, oh, you're just lazy. All right, you just want free handouts while they receive gigantic, enormous handouts, right? We got some ranchers. Northern California defies state orders to cut water usage. The Yurok and Kurok tribes have blown the whistle on ranchers in Northern California who are defying state orders to curtail water usage by diverting flow from the Shasta River, imperiling already endangered salmon of the Califma tributaries. The tribes say the diversion led to a 37% decrease in Shasta River flows from 58 cubic feet per second in 36 in 2 hours on August 17th. Like, this is just capitalist extraction, right? Like, look at what's happening, right? The state finally comes in and says, "Oh shit, it's a real crisis," right? We've got this enormous water crisis that's actually happening in California. We're seeing rivers and lakes dry up, and what's the response from the capitalists? We don't care. We don't care. We're gonna just do what we want, right? And they'll say things like, looks forward to working with the numerous agencies to protecting the health of the river. They don't care about the health of the river, right? They don't care. It's an extractive system. The point is to just make a product to sell. The state water board needs to act immediately to hold these illegal diverters accountable. We know the drought is tough on the agricultural community, but once these fish are gone, they are gone forever. And then you find out that the state water board is owned by these diverters. Right? That's how this is going to work, right? That the people who are diverting the water, the people who are stealing the water, own the state water board, right? Like, that's capitalism, baby. That's how it is. Which kind of begs the question, is the United States headed for a civil war? This is a question that's being asked in the Washington Post. This is Jeff Bezos' paper, right? Fighting words and extremism are on the rise. We are not yet in Turner Diaries territory, but that doesn't mean the country will avoid violent conflict. It's easy and logical to conclude that the United States today stands as close to the edge of civil war as it has since 1861. A broad variety of voices, including Republican and Democratic politicians, academics who study civil strife, and extremists on both ends of the spectrum, now accept the idea that civil war is either imminent or necessary. They point to evidence that can seem persuasive: a blizzard of threats against FBI agents, judges, elected officials, school board members, and election supervisors, training camps where heavily armed radicals practice to confront their own government, and polls showing that many Americans expect violent conflict. But it's also easy and logical to conclude that the florid rhetoric from a right-wing extremists, the worried warnings in mainstream media, and the hail of threats and individual attacks after this month's surprise FBI search of Donald Trump's South Florida mansion add up to something well short of the frightening prospect of civil war. People who track such threats say this summer's violent outbursts against federal officials and government institutions amount to one more concerning surge of rage in a pattern that has persisted throughout the pandemic, spiking after the murder of George Floyd 2 summers ago. But the Anti-Defamation League and other watchdog groups are not seeing the kind of specific planning by private militias and online assemblages of radicals that was evident before last year's January 6th insurrection and the white supremacist march in Charlottesville in 2017. We are living in a country where disinformation, conspiracy thinking, and lies have resulted in deadly attacks, said Orrin Siegel, vice president of the ADL Center of Extremism. It's not exactly kumbaya in this society, but we've been going through this for a long time now, and I don't see people coming together in a more coherent organizing we saw prior to January 6th. Contrast that perspective with that of Stephen Marsh, author of The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future, who posits that as extremist threats have become more lurid and specific, their rhetoric has leached into the mainstream, leading, for example, the Texas state government to spell out instances in which it would defy federal authority, and the Texas Republican Party to declare President Biden the acting president, and seek a voter referendum on seceding from the United States. When he sees small groups of armed men training for combat against government agents, Marsh, a Canadian novelist, wants to ring warning bells. The alarm is getting much more serious, and it's accelerating very quickly, he said. The kind of chaos I'm describing is like internet rage. You could take it as a play acting, or you could be deadly serious. It could be weekend fun or actual military preparation. He, along with some of the other analysts on the left, right, and in between, thinks the current noise is a strong indicator that a hot civil war, one likely to feature bombings, assassinations, and other assaults on federal institutions and officials, may be imminent. This split over how seriously to take the threat of civil war is not just another example of America's deep divisions. It has the great benefit of existing on a foundation of shared facts. Both sets of analysts, those who say we're heading towards civil strife, and those who say the threat matrix is largely limited to lone rangers and small disorganized groups, whose dangerous but scattered acts don't constitute a civil war, agree there is little chance of an organized violent attack on the government, or of local or state authorities taking up arms against their federal counterparts. But there remains a sharp divide over whether a mounting series of individual or small group attacks could add up to a warlike conflict that destabilizes the country. What both sides in the Civil War debate do agree on is that a more disturbing trend, at this point more dangerous than the sporadic bursts of violence in recent years, is the pervasive loss of trust, hope, and sense of belonging in a severely damaged society. And both sides agree we have been here before. A quarter century ago, after the bombing of the Oklahoma City Federal Building, I interviewed William Pierce, the physics professor turned neo-Nazi organizer whose novel, The Turner Diaries, had been taken by the bomber Timothy McVeigh as a planning document for launching civil war. In the book, white supremacists conspire to bomb FBI headquarters and spark a wider war against the government. McVeigh had excerpts from the book in his getaway car when he killed 168 people and injured hundreds more. Pierce, a provocateur who took great pride in his book's popularity among white supremacists and other extremists, told me that his aim, and that of those he hoped would read his book, was to overthrow the government and rid the country of Jews and blacks. People don't use that book as a blueprint, but as inspiration, Pierce told me. I don't have the time to write just for entertainment. It's to explain things to people. I'd like to see North America become a white continent. He wrote that if we don't destroy the system before it destroys us, if we don't cut this cancer out of our living flesh, our whole race will die. Pierce, who died in 2002, told me he expected individual violent acts inspired by his book to become more frequent. Terrorism only makes sense if it can be sustained, he said. One day there will be real organized terrorism done according to plan, aimed at bringing down the government. For several decades, the Turner Diaries has remained a go-to text for violent extremists, showing up frequently in online chatter excuse me, by participants in and supporters of the January 6th attack. In the meantime, the internet has blossomed into a far more insidiously efficient tool for those who seek to foment discord and terrorism. Yet although Pierce's work still inspires single actors and small groups, his wider war has never come close to fruition. Today, civil war is a rallying cry that some Americans wear on t-shirts and others openly train for with assault weapons. Since the Mar-a-Lago search on August 8th, lock and load and civil war have trended on pro-Trump social media, such as Gab and Telegram. Belligerent rhetoric has also become part of everyday campaigning among some Republicans. A GOP candidate in Florida's 11th House District, Laura Loomer, who narrowly lost her primary Tuesday, wrote on Telegram on August 8th that it's time to take the gloves off. If you're a freedom-loving American, you must remove the words decorum and civility from your vocabulary. This is war. Conservative YouTuber and podcaster Steven Crowder tweeted on the day of the FBI's descent on Mar-a-Lago that tomorrow is war. It's time to fight for every square inch, he reiterated the next day. It's time to fight fire with fire. The pro-Trump Gateway pundit site wrote, "This means war." On various pro-Trump social media platforms, people talked about buying ammunition and drilling for confrontation with federal agents. "Civil war, pick up arms, people," one agitated person tweeted. Such talk has been a mainstay of the Trump years. Last summer, Representative Madison Cawthorn, an election denier, alleged that U.S. election systems are rigged, which he said would lead to one place, and that's bloodshed. In a new book, We'll Be Back, The Fall and Rise of America, conservative writer Kurt Schlichter games out a civil war and concludes that blue states face a challenge. It's nice to hold cities, but if you do not also hold out all the rural territory between the cities, as well as the routes to the place where you are getting your food and fuel, he wrote, you have a real problem. Trump himself, speaking against the teaching of critical race theory at South Carolina rally this spring, said America's fate ultimately depends upon the willingness of its citizens to lay down, and they must do this, lay down their very lives to defend their country. One of Trump's leading critics in his own party, Representative Adam Kinzinger, said early this year on ABC's The View that civil war could erupt. "We have to warn and talk about it so that we can recognize that and fight hard against it," said Kinzinger, one of two Republicans on the House committee investigating the January 6th attacks. But Kinzinger has also warned against embracing Civil War rhetoric, tweeting in May, "How about we stop the Civil War lust? Buy some G.I. Joes or something." In a nation where firearms purchases have almost doubled since the start of the pandemic, driven mainly by fears of rising crime, political unrest, and the insecurity of life in the age of COVID-19, appeals like Kinzinger's have fallen all too flat. When the Reverend Sun Myung Moon sought to win Americans to his political and spiritual cause, the Unification Church, in the 1970s, he recruited people to sell flowers and ginseng door to door. Now his son, Hyung Jin Moon, seeks to win followers for his Rod of Iron Ministries by sponsoring training sessions at his compounds in Texas and Pennsylvania. Practice, he says, for a coming patriots' war against the deep state. The Moon's churches are both fringe groups, but Hyung Jin's organization has hosted Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, and current Pennsylvanian Republican gubernatorial candidate, Doug Mastriano, for its Freedom Festival events. Moon's group is one of the many radical organizations that are increasingly open about their plans. A Brookings Institute study tracked several hundred private militia groups that use anti-government rhetoric to attract Americans worried about changing demographics, stagnant wages, and how the shift to a multiracial and multi-ethnic America will affect them. But such groups remain disparate and disjointed. Many activists who have called for confrontation with the government now claim they mean no such thing. They have flipped the accusation, saying leftists or government agents are out to smash conservative opposition by kindling fear of a civil war launched by right-wingers. Crowder, the YouTube host, called media reports about his tweets unintentional smear. Decrying the weaponization of a once professional FBI and the scandals amongst its wayward Washington hierarchy is not insurrectionary, Victor Davis Hanson, a fellow at Stanford Hoover's institution, wrote in American Greatness, an online journal generally supportive of Trump. Those who warn most of some mythical civil war are those most likely to incite one. Does all the noise add up only to vigorous opposition to the government, or is it evidence of concerted preparation for open warfare? The answer depends, in which part on what you think modern civil war would look like. Would large militias attack government institutions, or would a war be limited to haphazard acts by individuals and small guerrilla factions? Some say a war of sorts has begun. The Second American Civil War is already occurring. Robert Reich, Labor Secretary under President Bill Clinton, declared in The Guardian, but it is less of a war than a kind of benign separation analogous to unhappily married people who don't want to go through the trauma of a formal divorce. Reich foresees not a violent division of the country, but rather something analogous to Brexit, a lumbering, mutual decision to go separate ways on most things, but remain connected on a few big things, such as national defense, monetary policy, and civil and political rights. Still, many Americans believe that a true violent civil war is coming. About half of those surveyed this spring by the University of California at Davis's Violence Prevention Research Program said they expected civil war in the next few years. Another poll by the Survey Center on American Life, a nonpartisan project affiliated with the Conservative American Enterprise Institute, found more than 1/3 of Americans agreeing that the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. Groups seeking to battle the government have popped up regularly through American history. To determine when such movements around the world have exploded into real civil wars, Barbara Walter, a political scientist at the University of California at San Diego, and author of How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them, points to two predictive factors. Countries stuck in an unstable zone between democracy and autocracy are more susceptible to armed conflict, and countries with weakened governments and populations deeply divided by identity, by race, ethnicity, or religion can fall into civil war. Walter sees the Republican Party embracing an almost white supremacist strategy that attracts far-right activists eager to fight the federal government. But other scholars look at the same evidence and see the potential for violence stabilizing or diminishing. Juliette Kayyem, who heads the Homeland Security program at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, argues that violent movements either grow or shrink. As Trump increasingly looks to his supporters like a loser, she sees them wandering away. The ideology is not defeated, it simply stops motivating people to action, she wrote in The Atlantic this month. The rhetoric of war is vastly more common than war itself. Violent and dark languages has been at the core of Trump's appeal for many years. Trump's choice for governor of Arizona, former TV news anchor Kari Lake, for instance, tells crowds that the government is rotten to the core, meaning America is dead. The kind of end-time speech strikes some disturbed or radicalized people into an invitation to uprising. But historians and security analysts who studied the latest evidence of Civil War planning mainly foresee the kinds of scattered terrorism that the country experienced in the late 1960s and early 70s, not anything like the build-up to 1860. March has dug into prepper conferences, far-right gatherings, and the darkest of online rabbit holes, trying to discern whether their war plans are weekend fun or actual military preparations. It's hard to distinguish the fantasists from the people who are actually going to do it, he said in an interview. In the end, he pronounces himself really scared. No one would call the strife of the 1960s Civil War, but there was enormous violence in that time, Marsh said. 140 cities burned, and that's in a time when you still had a level of institutional trust that could mitigate the violence. Now, however, collapsed trust in institutions such as the police, news media, churches, and government makes the country more vulnerable to internal attacks, he argues. Add this year's Supreme Court decision on abortion rights, and you now have another situation like in 1860, where you have two legal statuses of people in different parts of the country, and it just can't hold, he said. Still, Marsh notes that America changes all the time. Reinvention is in the absolute DNA of the country. Siegel, who tracks extremism for the ADL, sees this month's burst of war threats as one more sign that the system is ripe for targeting, with the FBI now the focus of violent rhetoric and attacks, like school boards, election workers, and medical professionals before it. This may not trigger a wider rash of violence, but the danger has not passed. Based on what happens in the November elections, extremists will adjust and find a boogeyman, he said. Siegel retains hope that holding January 6 perpetrators to account and investigating Trump's role in fomenting that attack will somehow round the edges of the situation. It's hard to see a civil war emerging from the current mess, but as Siegel said, I'm more concerned about what we can't see. A somewhat optimistic article, if you ask me. To me, the larger threat isn't necessarily an official civil war, but rather the balkanization of the United States. I think as I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, it's more likely that states are going to start to secede. That Robert Reich was kind of onto it here. That I think that there is going to be a general balkanization of the United States. That states are going to begin peeling off as they begin to recognize and realize that they're not getting anything for supporting the federal government, which I think is fundamentally the complaint, right? The fundamental complaint of these people who are calling for civil war against the federal government, and they see their federal government as an oppressor. Well, because it is. Because you give them a whole bunch of money in taxes and you get absolutely nothing for it, right? And that's just getting more and more obvious as time moves forward. And you're starting to see, like, you have lots of people are noticing, like, hey, we're giving up like billions of dollars to this Ukrainian war effort. Can we get any amount of money? Can any amount of that money be used in my state? Can any amount of that money be used in education? Can any amount of that money be used in healthcare? No? Oh, what are we paying for? What are we getting? Exactly. Yeah, Major writes, I feel bad for those poor defenseless FBI agents. Exactly. Ligandes says people will be collecting former United States of America merches like Rhodesian merches. Yeah, I remember that talk during Obama too. I hear often people talking about ammo collecting in the gun community. Yeah. Discontent is everywhere. Yeah, Deputy Prime Minister Freeland was scoffed by a freedom convoyer. Yeah. We got this right here from the Tyee, which we'll talk about, I think, tomorrow. All right, guys. Like, share, subscribe, hit all the bells, hit all the whistles. You know the thing to do. I hope you're all doing well out there. Always remember, each and every one of you is a quantum being living in quantum energy. a temporal refugee. The billionaires are spending hundreds of billions of dollars in the hopes you'll never realize it. You'll just stay the good little commodity they need you to be. Rebel. Revolt. Repent. Good luck. We're going to need it. Great.